Well, we were talking before the show, but we're going to split chapter 3 into
Yeah.
3 parts. I love this. So this is part 1 of 3 parts. What's that about?
Yeah, I was just kind of pulling my hair out. So believe it or not, we're going to spend 2 episodes on the first verse of Exodus 3.
I love it.
It's just I can't get away from it. So the way it's going to break down is this episode is going to be about Midian and Sinai, and also Yahweh's southern origin, which might be new to some listeners. And then next time we're going to be part 2 will be on the Kenite hypothesis, which again might be new to a number of listeners. But I'm going to telegraph it this way. On the surface, the Kenite hypothesis is about Moses' lineage, and part of that is concerns Edom and Esau's line. We've already made comments about that on an earlier episode, and sort of the where the other half of Abraham's family wound up, the descendants of Esau, and how that factors into Israelite history at this point. Having said that, the Kenite hypothesis is ultimately related back in scholarship to Cain, Genesis 4. And believe it or not, there is a Watcher's connection here. I have not written anything on Cain and Genesis 4, but again, it might sound goofy, but believe it or not, you're going to get that in part 2. When we're going to be in the book of Exodus, talking about Exodus 3, and somehow we're going to wind up talking about Watcher's story as well. And then part 3 is going to be the revelation of the divine name, which is what everybody sort of associates with Exodus 3, where at the burning bush incident. So there you go. I just had to keep them separate. There's too much detail for all of that in one episode, so here we are.
I'm looking for part 2. Anytime you can connect the Watchers to anything, I'm all about it.
Yeah, I know people are going to hear that and go, what in the world? I mean, I thought Heiser had 2 heads, now he's got 3. No, I'm going to be building off, I'll give this much of a clue as well. I'm going to be building off the work of another scholar, Philip Essler, who's done a lot of work on the Watcher traditions. And he's a lesser known scholar, but has some really important material on the Watcher traditions, and he goes into Cain a lot. And once you get into the Kenite stuff, you got to go back to Cain, because that's just part of the discussion. And so we're going to have to get into the woods there. It sounds odd, but hey, that you just follow the threads, and I'm not making anything up. It's the same thing we always do. We just talk about the work of biblical scholars on all sorts of things, and some of them see some pretty interesting connections here.
Well, we love the weeds.
yeah, we're getting a lot of that here. Even more so than I imagined. I had a what was I thinking moment a few days ago, trying to unravel this. Like, why did I suggest Exodus? What happened to me? I can usually see, where something's going to just evolve into too much work, and I must have just blanked out. But
well, this is your wheelhouse. This is exactly what we expected. 3 parts on one. On chapter 3 there alone. I mean, that's exactly, we've got 2 parts in chapter 2.
Yeah.
Or was that chapter 1?
Well, I mean, not every chapter is going to be like this. Okay. But Exodus 3 just sort of lends itself to it. Well, we might as well jump in. I mean, this is again going to be a bit gnarly. There's an element of difficulty here, and I have a makeshift map that I'm going to have Trey upload to the episode site. It's actually best if you're looking at the map, or you got to get the map fixed in your head while you listen to this episode, because we're going to be dealing with some geographical stuff. So there's a visual component here again, and visual stuff doesn't normally translate well to audio podcasts. But again, we're just going to make a good faith effort and put a map up there so that you can reference it. But we're going to get into some things that it's just essential, unless you sort of have a really good sort of orientation to the geography of Canaan and the Transjordan, and of course the Sinai Peninsula and the Arabian Peninsula. If you know that already, well then you're good. But most listeners will not, and they'll need to look at a map. So let's, for the sake of the episode, just rehearse Exodus 3:1, if it's not already fixed in our minds, because we've traversed through here a bit before. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, some preliminaries here. We've already brought up, and now we're going to drill down into the relationship between Sinai and Horeb. The mountain here is called Horeb in Exodus 3:1. Elsewhere, it's called Sinai. Most of the time, it's called Sinai. And also the relationship between Sinai and Horeb and Midian, okay, the place known as Midian. Secondly, we are going to need to deal with the relationship of all that, Sinai, Horeb, and Midian, with quote unquote Yahweh's march from the south traditions in the Hebrew Bible. Now, this is going to be unfamiliar to a number of listeners, but it's just sort of, it's all over the place. I mean, you can't discuss Exodus 3 and really Exodus 6 without getting into this material. So this is why we're doing it specifically, and we'll look at all these passages that are relevant. Yahweh is said in the Hebrew Bible in a number of places to have come to his land or come to his temple from the south. And the passages explicitly define the south with geographical terms like Paran, Timan, Seir, and Edom. Okay, so if you're thinking already, well, the south, that would be the Mount Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, the traditional site of Sinai. Or if you're thinking, oh, well, Jebel el-Lawz, in Midian, I think that's Mount Sinai, and that's south of Canaan. So that's what those passages are talking about. Sorry, they're not. Again, they use specific geographical terms: Paran, Timan, Seir, and Edom. So either the association with Midian in Exodus 3:1, and at least another passage, for Yahweh's abode is reconcilable with those other places, or we have contradicting traditions. So there's real issue here. These other places are a good bit to the north, again, of where people typically want Sinai to be, either the traditional location, way down the Sinai Peninsula, at the V of the two forks of the Red Sea, right in there. Or again, as this idea comes and goes, but the idea that Sinai is in Saudi Arabia at Jebel el-Lawz, which is to the east, about, I don't know, midway, maybe a two-thirds of the way up the fork, the right-hand fork of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba. Again, those other places are a good bit north, they're a good bit south to Edom, Timan, Paran, and Seir. So we have to figure out either a way to reconcile some of this stuff, or we've got contradictions. Now, I'm going to suggest that there's a way to understand all of the data collectively, but the way that I'm going to suggest undermines both the traditional view of Sinai and the Jebel el-Lawz location of Sinai. Both of them, I think, go out the window if you are going to try to reconcile holy mountain, Sinai, Horeb stuff with Yahweh coming from the south. Both of those locations are too far south of Timan, Paran, Seir, and Edom. They just are. It just doesn't work. So this is another reason why I said, if you come across people, I know for sure where Mount Sinai is, if they are not dealing with the passages we're going to deal with today that have Yahweh coming from these regions that are much farther north, but of course still south of Canaan, if they're not dealing with these passages, you can politely dismiss them because they have not dealt with important data. So I'm hoping that, again, that being the case is going to be clear. Now, you might ask, well, why bother, with all this? I mean, again, we're into the weeds here. And for me, there's three reasons. I think we do need to be faithful to the details of the text and offer a coherent resolution to what seems on the surface contradictory. At least some think it's contradictory. And I'll add that if we do that, the resolution that I'm going to offer here will also be helpful in the next episode, next week, with the Kenite hypothesis, that whole issue. Second, I would say I'm hoping that this will convince listeners to not get sidetracked on rabbit trails like the idea that Mount Sinai is in Arabia or that determining the location of Mount Sinai has any theological importance. It really doesn't. I think those are distractions that can grow into dogma as though something crucial has been discovered. There's nothing crucial here in the way of theology or eschatology or anything like that. The reality is that it's pretty unlikely that either the traditional location of Mount Sinai, again, deep in the Sinai Peninsula in the V of the two prongs of the Red Sea, otherwise known as Jebel Musa, or the alleged Mount Sinai in Arabia, Jebel al-Lawz, it's really unlikely that those are the real locations of Sinai. Again, if you care, and I do, and I'm not the only one, if you care about reconciling the mountain of God idea, again, Horeb Sinai, with the tradition of Yahweh coming from the south, then both of those locations are just not going to work. And I do care. I think it's important that all of the data be reconciled. And again, that issue itself might be new to listeners, but again, it's in your Bible. I don't write the stuff. This is just the reality of the text. We have to deal with it. And third, I think the point needs to be made that, again, the Yahweh from the South traditions can't be ignored, that they not only need to be aligned with Exodus 3, but this is also an issue for what we're going to run into in Exodus 6:3. Let me just read you that verse, where God says to Moses, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, El Shaddai. But by my name, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. Okay, that is actually wrapped up in the Yahweh from the South traditions. And here you have Moses, in a conversation with God, and you have that statement made. Critics have acted like the revelation of the divine name in Exodus 3 and that statement in Exodus 6:3 justify some sort of notion that there are separate, and this is a key word, utterly distinct origins for Yahweh worship. They act the same way with respect to Yahweh traditions from the south, Edom, Seir, Taman, Paran, and the descendants of Jacob in Egypt. The Bible presents us, I think, with a coherent picture, not one that should shock us into thinking Yahweh religion, again, another key term, originated somewhere other than with the Israelites in Egypt. The Bible's picture is that the deity is the same, but the names are different, and that the name revealed to Moses was already in use by an Abrahamic people, i.e. the descendants of Esau, doesn't undermine anything in biblical theology. I mean, that would be expected. The Old Testament pictures that Abraham's descendants went separate ways. The line of Jacob went one way, the line of Esau went another, because of the whole birthright issue. It's quite logical that both lines knew the God of their father Isaac and their grandfather Abraham and continued to worship him. The real issues are how Yahweh name use is known in Edomite or Esau territory, but seems to be new in terms of Moses in Exodus 3 and in Exodus 6:3. Now, we'll get into that in more detail in later episodes. We'll touch on it here. A short version, it's not impossible that the name Yahweh was known by Semites in Egypt long before Moses, who took it to the Edomite regions. I mean, there is a textual argument to be made, specifically in Egyptian texts, that the name Yahweh was known among Semites in the Sinai region, like in mines, mining contexts and whatnot. And, it's conceivable that some Semites knew the name Yahweh there and took it up north into Edom, Seir, Paran area. I mean, that's not impossible. I mean, the name does show up, in Egyptian material associated with, this region. So, Exodus 3 doesn't undermine that. You might say, well, Exodus 3 might undermine it. It sounds like Moses didn't know the name. Well, let's not forget where Moses was raised. He was raised in Pharaoh's household right after being weaned. Yes, he knew who he was ethnically. He knew he was a Hebrew. But it's quite possible he didn't know the name Yahweh. Why would Pharaoh's household, why would the people there be teaching him about that? He's not trained by his mother. His mother has him until he's weaned, and then he is in Pharaoh's household. it's quite conceivable, again, while he knows what his ethnicity is, that he has not heard the name of Yahweh. That's possible. Again, his break with Egypt, if you read the Moses story, is about injustice toward his people. He didn't like the fact that they were enslaved. It's not about religion. Moses doesn't break from Pharaoh's household because of religion. Okay, he's upset at what is happening to his ethnic kindred. And then he gets into trouble by murdering a man. And he escapes to Midian, where again, providentially, he runs into descendants of his forefather Abraham, who do happen to know the God of their fathers by the name Yahweh, historically. And then the name is revealed by God himself to Moses. This is a quite, you can take all this data, and you don't have to talk about, oh, well, this source used this name, and this source used that name, and the dirty little secret of Yahweh religion is that the people, the descendants of Jacob and Esau, they never heard of Yahweh, and this is a different God than what we see in the south in Edom and Paran, and they knew the name Yahweh, or religion has its origin somewhere else, and the Bible is trying to cover this up, or look, this is a quite understandable picture. It's just, this is the kind of thing that source critics love to, what's the right word? They love to grab it and then leverage it in all sorts of ways. It's quite unnecessary. And if you listen to this podcast, I'm not an opponent of editing in the Torah. Okay, how many times do I have to say this? I'm not an opponent of that. But typically what happens is source critical theory exaggerates and overstates data. And I think this is a good example of it. Again, it is quite conceivable that Moses had not heard this name, but he had heard of the God of his fathers at some point. He knew who the Hebrews were. Again, the name could have been, circulating in Egypt, at least among, the slaves working the mines in Sinai. Again, you do see this with certain, at least one people group that are associated with the Negev and with the even upward north to the regions we're talking about here, Edom and Paran and Taman. Again, they're still part of the line of Abraham, and they have this name, and maybe Moses doesn't. Now I say all of that to say this: Exodus 6:3, which generates a lot of this discussion that Moses didn't know the name, may actually not be translated the way it should be. I've commented on this on my blog that Exodus 6:3, if you follow the work of Francis Anderson, specifically in his book The Sentence in Biblical Hebrew, translates this quite different, where you don't have Moses not knowing the name. You have the opposite. And that's a little factoid that is almost never mentioned in the discussions of Exodus 6:3. Almost never. It's really rare. But Francis Anderson, again, I think he's still alive. This is the Anderson of Anderson Forbes, the database that we developed where I work at Logos. Francis Anderson is a premier Hebraist. That's probably a humble way to describe him. There are few who know their Hebrew as well as Francis Anderson. And so his work in this verse ought to be taken seriously, but it's rarely even mentioned. Because, again, people, writers, scholars want to leverage an idea, source criticism, alternate hypothesis for Israelite religion, whatever the case may be. That's just the way it is. So all of this is preliminary. I mean, we're going to get into the weeds again here in Exodus 3, but I'm telegraphing some of the things that we're going to run into, and some of what we'll do in this episode will actually, again, factor into some of that discussion. But for the sake of our episode at this point, I think it's really important that the Yahweh of the South traditions be reconciled, be understood alongside of passages like Exodus 3 and the Horeb and the Sinai traditions. I think they need to be understood together, and they can be. But if you do that, you really can't have Mount Sinai being in the southern Sinai Peninsula at the traditional location. And the Jebel El-Law's location doesn't really work well either. That one, it's not impossible, for it to work. I would say it's really, really, really unlikely. And that means that you'd have to come up with some other mountain. And there have been lots of proposals for Mount Sinai. It's not just those two. And my gut would tell me that if you're going to take the Yahweh from the South tradition seriously, one of those other possibilities might be the right one. So let's just jump in here. To refresh your memory, again, Exodus 3:1, now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And as I mentioned in a previous episode, the verse is typically read as though Moses is tending his father-in-law's flocks in Midian. And so the mountain of God seems to be in Midian. If you're doing the Jebel El Laws thing, that's the way you have to read this, that Sinai is in Midian. But the verse may also not be read that way. Again, the verse could be very obviously saying that Moses left Midian and journeyed a little ways to the west. We actually do not know where in Midian Moses was, and that's a problem. I mean, Midian's a pretty big area. We don't know exactly where he was. And if we're going to read it as Moses goes somewhere else and then comes to the mountain of God, well, that opens the door to other possibilities. You have to decide to read Exodus 3:1 in a specific way to have Moses tending his flocks in Midian at Mount Sinai. And this is what the movie does, the Ten Commandments movie. If you remember the Ten Commandments movie, it's like Mount Sinai is like, a couple hundred yards, from where, Moses is and where he and Zipporah are living. There's nothing in the text that tells you that. Nothing at all. So all we've got is Moses is somewhere in Midian. The text is clear that he leads the flocks, quote, to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb. He has to go, so he has to make a journey to get to the mountain of God. That's what it says. It doesn't say that he was already at the mountain of God, like the Ten Commandments movie has it. Like the verse doesn't suggest that Moses had to lead the flocks of Jethro a few hundred yards. No, I think it's much more coherent to say Moses had to take him somewhere else. And that somewhere else, to the west of Midian, is where we find this mountain of God. That's where Moses' encounter with Yahweh occurs. Now, that's important to keep in mind that Moses has to essentially leave Midian, or at least leave the part of Midian where he was, which again, we don't actually know precisely where that was. Where Jethro lived. Okay, we don't know where that is. We just know it's in Midian. It's a big area. But the fact that he has to leave and he winds up going west, well, again, we know he's not at Jebel El Laws, because if he went west, he'd run into the Gulf of Aqaba, the ocean. Okay, it's not a wilderness where you're going to have herds. Okay, so that's an absurdity. So he's going to have to go beyond the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba somewhere. He's going to have to go north and northwest. The west would be, you got to clear the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, the right prong of the Red Sea, and now you can find some area where you can take your flocks. Okay, so that much we know. Well, if you go far enough north, you're in Paran, Timon, Seir, Edom area. I mean, there's a place where Midian blurs into Edomite territory to the north. And if it's northwest, it's also going to blur into Canaan territory. Again, we just don't know where. Nobody's out there with surveyors' poles and marking land, okay? But these three regions, Midian, Edom, again, Seir, and the Paran, Timon area, there's going to be a place where they're basically kind of on top of each other, one to the north, one to the northwest, okay? And so you can imagine very easily that Moses would have taken the flocks northward, from some point in Midian. And frankly, since we know that Moses wasn't like living at Jebel El Laws, okay, that's not where he was, because if he goes west, he's going to run into salt, he's going to run into the Red Sea, okay? So he's probably somewhere already north in Midian, and then he would have migrated west, just like Exodus 3:1 says. He took the flocks to the west, okay? The edge of the side of the wilderness, okay? west side of the wilderness. So he's already going to be up there, and the move west again could take him into where these other areas converge. Again, we have to use our imagination here because we aren't given latitude and longitude in Exodus 3 or anywhere else. We're given approximations. But again, my concern is that we take the material of Exodus 3 and passages like it, and then the Yahweh from the South traditions. We need to understand them collectively. That's important, for consistency. Now let's refresh our memory a little bit as to what Midian was. So Moses is somewhere in Midian. Again, the place of encounter is associated with Paran, Timon, Seir, and Edom. So we have, I think I read this last time or previous episode from Sarna in his Exodus commentary. The Midianites ranged over a wide area of the Near East, stretching from the eastern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba up through the Syro-Arabian desert and into the borders of the land of Israel, west and northwest of Eilat. Now, Eilat is right at the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, the right prong of the Red Sea. And so Midian is sort of all of that. And again, that helps orient us. If you need the map, please look at it. Now, how would we start to kind of pull all this stuff together? You don't know what the Yahweh from the South passages are because I haven't read them. I'm going to do that now, but just be thinking about Midian. Thinking about the map or looking at the map, you've got the Red Sea, the two prongs. The right-hand prong is the Gulf of Aqaba. The tip of that is Eilat. Midian is going to be to the east of that and also, again, to the north of that, the west and the northwest of Eilat. So right when you clear the tip, again, Moses is somewhere in there. Midian's going to encompass a good part of what we call today the Arabian Peninsula, where Saudi Arabia is. And he's going to be somewhere in there, and he's going to move to the west, to the west of the wilderness, all right? So he's moving, either west or northwest. Okay, we don't know. We don't have latitude and longitude. But that's going to move him into the areas where Midian touches, overlaps with, the borders are fuzzy with these southern places, Paran, Timon, Seir, Edom. Now let me read you a few passages. Deuteronomy 33:1 says, "This is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the people of Israel before his death. He said, the Lord, Yahweh, it's the divine name, came from Sinai and dawned from Seir, S-E-I-R, upon us." Let me repeat that. The Lord came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. Oh boy. Not only do you have Sinai linked to Seir, which is, again, this Edomite region south of Canaan, but we have Mount Paran as the place that Yahweh came forth from. Well, I thought it was Sinai. Oh, I thought it was Horeb. Well, the answer very well may be, yep. All of those terms could apply to the same place. They could. Now, critics, of course, want to split them all out, as though they must be different places. They don't have to be different places. I mean, in theory, they could be. Then you'd have different conflicting traditions. Again, this is where they want you to go. But they don't have to be, is the point. They don't have to be. Again, Mount Paran, if you read this verse, would be the same as Mount Sinai, which would be Horeb. So, but where is that? Well, I don't know. Neither does anybody else, is the point. Again, you can't reconcile the traditional location of Sinai with Deuteronomy 33:1 and 2. Because the passage reads, again, pretty transparently, that Sinai is associated with Seir and Mount Paran. These regions are south of Canaan. So these are part of a matrix of passages, matrix of ideas, really, in biblical scholarship that scholars call the Yahweh from the South traditions. Okay, and Midian, sorry, but Jebel El Lawz is not in Seir, and it's not in Paran. It just isn't. Let's go to Habakkuk 3. God came from Timon. This is verse 3, Habakkuk 3:3. I'm going to read 3 through 7. God came from Timon, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. There it is again, just like it was in Deuteronomy 33, verse 2. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand. By the way, that language, some of that is reminiscent of Deuteronomy 33. Okay. There he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. Here's verse 7. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. So now this brings Midian into the picture, also with Timon and Paran. And there's only one way you can do that, again, to have this, whatever's happening here and whatever peak this is, that it's in some area that it could be perceived as Midian and Seir, and we're going to get Edom. Again, these places converge or overlap. And again, when I say that, you can't be thinking of like maps of countries today where there are strictly defined borders. You just don't have that. Again, these are regions that don't have that level of precision as to their border lines. There's a fuzziness to all this. Okay? And the passage, Habakkuk 3, associates Mount Paran, which Deuteronomy 33, 1 and 2 link to Sinai and Seir. It links Paran to Midian. So Timon, Paran, and Seir and Midian are somehow interrelated. Now this is possible, again, if by Midian we mean that northernmost, northwesternmost parameters, where it borders Edom to the north and southern Canaan to the west. And by the way, I would think that if you took that, if you thought about that, and then you read Exodus 3:1, where you have Moses taking his flock to the west side of the wilderness, you can reconcile those things. Again, especially since we don't know where Moses' starting point was. He could have been due east of where all this is happening, and then he moves straight west. We don't know. We just know from these descriptions, the Yahweh from the South traditions, which again link Midian into this, some portion, some part perceptively of Midian with these southern regions, Edom, Seir, Paran, Timon. Judges 5 is another one of these, 4 and 5. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens dropped. See, there you get apocalyptic, this cataclysmic language that we just read. We just read from Habakkuk 3, where God was coming from Timon and Mount Paran. But now we get Seir and Edom. The earth trembled, the heavens dropped, the clouds dropped water, the mountains quaked before the Lord, even Sinai before the Lord, the God of Israel. That's Judges 5, 4, and 5. Now, this passage juxtaposes Seir and Edom and once again makes Sinai part of the picture. Verse 4's association of Seir and Edom, of course, makes sense because Seir, according to the Archaeological Encyclopedia of the Holy Land, was the name of a mountainous region southeast of the Dead Sea. Again, if you're looking at the map, you're going to see that. It was formerly inhabited by Horites, Genesis 14:6, and boy, isn't that interesting. We can't really get into the people groups here or in the next few weeks either. Formerly inhabited by the Horites where Esau lived later. Esau lived later. Okay, I can't resist it. Go back and read Deuteronomy 2 and 3. Okay, get that spasm out of the way. Where Esau lived later. Again, this area identified with Edom in Genesis 36:8 and following. So how are we to deal with the data? And we got 3 passages here. I would say, just in basic terms, there's no way to get the traditional site of Sinai near Edom. So I'm not a believer in the traditional site, Jebel Musa, for being Mount Sinai. I also don't think there's a way to get Jebel El-Lawz into Edom or near Edom, because it isn't. It's farther down, adjacent to the Gulf of Aqaba, in sort of, in that portion of Midian. It's not in Edom. It's not near Paran or Timon. So my suggestion is let's stop trying to defend either of these views. Here's a proposal. Again, it's sort of like a working hypothesis, and then we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of it here. I would say that maybe this is what happened. Again, this is a working hypothesis. It's a work in process as well. Moses leaves Midian proper, which is east, and again, we don't know where he is, possibly even already north of the Gulf of Aqaba, northeast of the Gulf of Aqaba. He's somewhere in Midian up there. He takes Jethro's flocks westward or northwestward. He's going to be clear the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba where Eilat is located. And he's moving again westward or northwestward, at least slightly, to honor Exodus 3:1, the language there. He winds up somewhere in the vicinity of the northwest fringe of northern Midian, where Midian borders the southern border of Canaan, and where it also blurs into the land of Edom. Again, look at the map. It is somewhere in this location, somewhere in this region, where all these things are possible, all these things are in play, that Moses encounters Yahweh on a mountain, variously called Sinai or Horeb. We saw last time that Horeb, again in a previous episode, Horeb may simply refer to a dry area. That's what it means. May simply refer to a dry area that included a mountainous region. As Sarna said, Horeb may have been the name of a wider region in which Mount Sinai, a specific peak, was located. Again, and then at Horeb could be in this, this geographical region we're talking about. Edom, Seir, all that, because Seir again is a mountainous region, as we just read. There's going to be some peak there that eventually lent its name to the entire area, perhaps. Horeb again means desolate or dry, but maybe Horeb becomes later associated as a term with the specific mountain in this region that could be spoken of as being somewhere still associated with Midian up north, associated with Edom and Seir and Paran and Timon, that area. Okay, somewhere in that area, all this stuff happens. I'm going to take you back to Sarna a little bit again here. We've already mentioned that Horeb means desolate and dry. We read earlier Exodus 17:1-7, and this is the incident at Rephidim. So we read that, read it again, we'll just start from verse 1. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. There was no water for the people to drink. So then they cry out for water, so on and so forth, and then Moses cries to the Lord in verse 4, what am I supposed to do with these people? They're ready to stone me. And then God says in verse 5, the Lord said to Moses, pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. Now, again, this Horeb reference here, Sarna pointed out that if you look at the Israelite itinerary, their journeyings, Rephidim was the last station of the Israelites before entering the wilderness of Sinai. So this place where they're at, Rephidim, which has this rock at Horeb, is not Sinai. It's the last station of the Israelites before entering the wilderness of Sinai. And then Sarna says, we may be dealing with different strands of tradition, or Horeb may have been the name of a wider region in which Mount Sinai, a specific peak, was located. Perhaps that peak eventually lent its name to the entire area. So, none of that, again, the separation of Horeb from Sinai, that doesn't undermine, again, what I'm proposing about all of these terms being interrelated, because, again, the region itself might be what Horeb is referencing. And again, if it is associated with Seir and Timon and Paran, Seir, again, is a mountainous region. You could have one specific peak somewhere, in that geographical zone that we really can't define, but somewhere south of Canaan, because Yahweh comes from the south, somewhere that's still adjacent to Midian, so we can talk about Midian. And again, it's going to be north, possibly northwest of the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba. Okay, you somewhere up there. If you factor this in, the hypothesis is still workable, that there's a distinction between the mountain, Sinai proper and Horeb. Okay, good, fine. Dry place. that later becomes known by a single, who knows? Ultimately, who knows? What I'm trying to get you to see is that these disparate data points are not irreconcilable. There is a way that they can be imagined as functioning together, and inclusive of the Yahweh from the South traditions. Now let's go back to Exodus 3:1 real briefly. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now the way ESV has that translated, it suggests that the mountain of God was called Horeb. But the Hebrew text actually doesn't require that, and might even contradict it. So again, we don't have to have Horeb even be specifically in this verse associated with a singular peak. So this whole regional idea, and then by tradition, one part of one mountain in this region becomes identified. I mean, that's workable. But I just want to point out here in this particular verse that ESV might be a little misleading, unintentionally. The Hebrew has El Har Ha Elohim Korbah. Literally, he takes the flocks to the mountain of God, to Horeb. What we have here on the proper name for Horeb, this Chet Resh Bet, we have a He on the end. It's called a locative He. It denotes location. In Hebrew, sometimes the letter He, the H, is added to a noun to denote going to that place. It's called the locative He. So Horeb might merely denote a dry place that Moses goes to. He went to the mountain of God, to Horeb. So in other words, the mountain of God is in Horeb, but the mountain of God isn't necessarily named Horeb. Could very well be the understanding of Exodus 3:1, but the ESV doesn't give you that impression, and other translations as well. Again, consequently, why am I bringing it up? Because it's another factor here that if Moses left Midian and traveled to the mountain of God in or at this region, this place called Horeb, which was in a wilderness area, or at least adjacent to one, that doesn't seem incompatible at all with Exodus 17:1-7, where Horeb, dry area, and Sinai, the mountain, are not synonymous either. So they don't have to be synonymous in Exodus 3:1, and they don't have to be synonymous in Exodus 17. Again, these things are compatible, is the point. Now, there are other data that can be factored into this as well. And in the next two episodes, we'll hit more of that, especially when we hit the Kenite issue and the revelation of the divine name. But I want to, we're going to, again, say more about what I'm going to jump into now in those episodes, but I want to sort of get into it a little bit here. And that is with respect to Yahweh traditions, the name Yahweh in other places. Now I'm going to read from DDD. This is the entry on Yahweh, where the author is Vandertoorn says, there are two Egyptian texts that mention Yahweh. In these texts from the 14th and 13th centuries BCE is what he uses. And by the way, that, again, the 13th century would be the late date century. These two texts are going to still be too late for the early date of the Exodus. There are two Egyptian texts that mention Yahweh that date from the 14th and 13th centuries BCE. Yahweh is neither connected with the Israelites, again in these texts, nor is his cult located in Palestine, i.e. Canaan. The texts speak about, quote, Yahu in the land of the Shasu Bedouins, unquote. The Egyptian is Ta Shasu Yahuwah. So the one text is from the reign of Amenophis III, which is the first part of the 14th century BC, and the other one is from the reign of Ramses II, 13th century BCE. Again, that's the late date pharaoh, late date option anyway. In the Ramses II list, the name occurs in a context which also mentions, believe it or not, seer. Oh, boy. It may tentatively be concluded then that this Yahu in the land of the Shasu Bedouins is to be situated in the area of Edom and Midian, of course, the northern northwest edge of Midian. So you actually have a reference to Yahu in Egyptian material, in Seir, in Edom. Again, there you go. This isn't like explosive. this is in concert with the picture, again, my working hypothesis that I just, laid out. So another quote about this material. This is from Mark Chavalis. This is from the Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch in the Moses entry. He says, Yahoo, YHW, is also the name of a Shasu country in connection with Midian and Seir. These references occur in an Egyptian eponym list from the time of Amenhotep III, circa 1400 BC, and in a text dated to Ramses II, a century later. Some have seen them as consistent with the poetic language in the Bible associating Yahweh with the region of Sinai, Seir, Edom, Paran, Teman, and Midian. And then he references Deuteronomy 33:2, Judges 5:4, and Psalm 68. We didn't read that one. Some have argued that the biblical Kenites, a branch of the Midianites, were the mediators of the Yahwistic cult, possibly by way of traders along the caravan routes from the south to the east. That's the end of the quote. Again, just another scholar, not only pointing out the Egyptian material, the reference to the name Yahweh in Midian and Seir, but also bringing the Yahweh from the south traditions into the picture. Again, this writer, Chavalis, is well acquainted with the fact that the Yahweh from the south traditions are part of this whole issue that we're talking about. Again, the mountain of God traditions and the divine name and all that sort of stuff. Now, there's more recent research on this, and I put this in the protected folder for those who are newsletter subscribers. This is a dissertation. It's available online, but I put it in the folder anyway. This is by Julianne Cooper, who is a man. Now, you might be thinking Julian would be a woman's name, but Julianne with an E, Cooper, who's at Yale now. But this was his PhD dissertation from the Department of Ancient History at Macquarie, I think I'm saying that correctly, University in Australia. And its title is Toponymy. A toponym, by the way, is a place name. Toponymy on the periphery. Place names of the Eastern Desert, Red Sea, and South Sinai in Egyptian documents from the early dynastic until the end of the New Kingdom. That's his dissertation. Now, he says on page 185 that the place name, the Yahweh of the Shasu Bedouin, he says whether this place name can be used as evidence for an early cult, the early worship of Yahweh, seems far from certain. And that's being honest. The name is at least used among a people, again, who are in the region of Seir, who by biblical standards would have descended from Esau. Again, they're still descendants of Abraham. But he's saying, it's just a place name. We don't know that it's evidence that Yahweh was actually worshipped there. Okay, that could be. I mean, we don't want to overstate the data. It's just an interesting observation. But I wanted to bring Cooper into the conversation for a different reason. While we're on the subject of etymology, what about the name Sinai? So Cooper, in his dissertation, discusses this name as well. On page 214, the other one was on page, I don't know if I gave it 185, 186. On page 214, Cooper writes this: the etymology of Sinai is usually explained through biblical Hebrew Senah, the bush. Senah is a name for bush, a word for bush. And it actually shows up in Exodus 3, verses 2 and 4. So, again, he's saying this is the way Sinai is usually explained as being a name derived from the place, the burning bush incident, where these bushes are, and Moses has this encounter. However, he says there's no consensus amongst biblical historians as to the etymology of Sinai. Connections to Semitic SN, tooth, Arabic Sinah, stone, and Sin, the Mesopotamian moon god and the territorial entity of Sin, have also been proposed as equally valid as Senah, bush. So, again, unpacking that paragraph, that's the end of the quote. What that means is that scholars have tried to figure out, where Sinai comes from, the term. The easiest and basically the most obvious is this, it comes from the passage, the bush there, Senah. But others have tried to find a derivation from Arabic and Proto-Semitic, and then some want to say, it comes from the Mesopotamian moon god Sin and all that stuff, okay? Now, the context for this discussion in Cooper, when he gets into this material, is an Egyptian term that is a hapax. That is a word that occurs one time in existing Egyptian texts, and it's chenhet in Egyptian. And Cooper theorizes it's probably a Semitic loan word. It's a word that's brought into Egyptian from a Semitic language. He says in Semitic languages, the T, the ch sound, the T underlined sound corresponded to Semitic samek, which is the first letter in Sinai in Hebrew. Now he goes on to discuss this, and I'm gonna disagree with him a little bit. I'm reading you this because we have geeks in the audience who like this kind of etymological stuff. But also, if you read Cooper's material, you're going to be wondering what I think about this. So I'm going to tell you. I'm going to just read a portion here. On page 214, he says, a difficulty with this connection, that is connecting it to Sinai, the bush, but I'll admit his wording in the dissertation is a little bit ambiguous here. I'm going to assume he's talking about the bush. He says, a difficulty with this connection is accounting for the final T in the Egyptian term chenhet, which must be a suffix, possibly a feminine marker. And typically in Egyptian, the T at the end of a noun is the marker for a feminine singular noun. And my comment to this is, why is that difficult? Sena is grammatically feminine and would have a T ending in the construct form anyway. So what's the deal? It's still the same grammatical gender. He continues, with what he's saying. In ancient Levantine toponymy, again, place names in the Levant, the Fertile Crescent area or Syria, Palestine, the suffix T is witnessed in toponyms, place names, but its exact morphological role is not apparent. Rainey suggests it may be a nominal or adjectival marker. Wherever Chenhet was, it was a large area comprised of multiple chasut. Now, some of you who are paying real attention to the podcast know what that term is. The Hekha Chasut, the rulers from foreign lands. Again, this is what the Hyksos, where the term Hyksos comes from. They were Semites. So lo and behold, we have Chenhet being a large area where there's lots of Semites there. The only text where it occurs, again, Chenhet, the Egyptian term, mentions it in the context of, he has a personal name there, which doesn't concern us right now. And it would seem to be in the environs of South Sinai or contiguous with Sinai. Now, this is me now. He's opining that on the basis of this personal name that he references, because the personal name he references happens to be from a text that talks about a mine in Sinai. So he's connecting these two things that don't necessarily be connected. If you have a large region where you've got Semites living, and again, what's known as Sinai could extend on the basis of other texts way, 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 way up north in the Negev, all the way up to to southern Canaan, then this is a conclusion. It's a non sequitur, actually. It's a conclusion that doesn't really follow the data. But he's making these comments based on this parallel with this one Egyptian text with this proper name on it that happens to be located in the southern Sinai. Now he writes, an equivalence with the biblical Sinai is tempting on these grounds, but the caveat here is there's about 1,000 years separating this toponym, this place named Chenhet, from the Sinai in the oldest biblical traditions, which he has here in 1000 BC. Again, my comment here. Are we really to believe that no Semites used the term Sinai, before the Hebrew Bible was written? Like, really? The term shows up in Egyptian texts from or near mines in the Sinai Peninsula, mines which we know were worked by Semites. I mean, this is going to be part of the Semitic vocabulary before you get the Hebrew Bible written. So why it matters that the Egyptian text is older, than the biblical text, I don't see why that matters at all. Again, there's a difference between a spoken language and a written language. Okay, the spoken language is going to exist before it gets codified in writing. So again, this is another conclusion that just doesn't follow in his dissertation. But since the chances are some of you are going to read this, I just thought I'd throw that in so you know what I thought. Now, my point here is that if you go out onto the internet, when we're talking about the name Sinai, if you go out on the internet, you have people writing about how Sinai was really a holy mountain to the moon god Sin. You're going to see that everywhere on the internet. It's Middle Earth, okay? Know two things. One, that idea isn't new. Okay, there are scholars of the Pan-Babylonian era especially that propose this. And number two, there are quite coherent alternatives. So you're going to you're going to have people you run into that read this stuff, and they're going to think they've stumbled onto something like this deep dark secret of the Bible that your church Christianity's tried to shield you from, and all this nonsense. Okay, You can find this in sort of antiquarian scholarship. And they'll use, again, that material, again, for the 19th century, early 20th century. But the reality is that there are quite coherent alternatives that have nothing to do with the moon god's sin as far as the name Sinai. So let's just point that out, and that's another freebie, just kind of prepping you with that. Another thing that I've put in the folder is an article by G.I. Davies, and it is entitled The Significance of Deuteronomy 1:2 for the Location of Mount Horeb. Now, Deuteronomy 1:2 says this. Let's go back to verse 1. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness, in the Arabah, opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Lavan, Hazeroth, and Dizahav. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. That's the verse that matters here. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. Now, Davies' article I have put into the protected folder again. Some of you might want to read it. It's important because it's one that raises important issues for thought, but I find it personally unpersuasive for a couple of reasons. And in case you read it, I want you to know what those reasons are, and you'll probably be able to figure these out on your own anyway. But the first one is that, let me just cut to the chase. Davies goes through all this data about determining, where you can go for how far you can get in 11 days, from this point or that point. And he uses this to argue that the best location of Mount Sinai is the traditional site, because on average it would take and he has a number of standards for this. Like he looks at old travel records, he looks at ancient records, he looks at modern caravan records, and archaeologists going from one point to the next. Basically, you can travel about 20 miles a day or something like that. 2022. And he says, well, 11 days, that's going to put you, up at Kadesh Barnea, and that's like 11 days from the traditional site of Mount Sinai. So that's the best, candidate for location. The other ones are too close for the 11 days. All right, so that's just in a nutshell. I disagree with that, and I'll tell you why. But the article's still important because of the things it makes you think about. So a couple of reasons I think that this is a little wrong-headed is that it doesn't work really with the geography of the Yahweh from the South traditions. And those are important. You have to factor them in, and he doesn't, okay? His calculations of how many miles can be traveled in a day all of them, you can read the article, they all assume that the travelers are adult males, either soldiers or civilians. They don't assume large numbers of women and children and larger than normal herds. Now, I will grant, and when we get to this part of Exodus, I'll explain why. I will grant that the Israelites may not have been in the millions. I don't think they were. But the nation was considerably larger than your normal caravan that Davies is doing his calculations by. His calculations do not conform to the conditions described in the Exodus itinerary. Again, I still think the point of Deuteronomy 1:2 is that it took the Israelites 11 days to go from one point to the next. Not that the 11 days allows for some calculation of mileage. I think it's a report. It took us 11 days, moving tens of thousands of people, and at a minimum, with at least half of those tens of thousands of people being women and children, along with the flocks, simply cannot be calculated by normal caravan travel, and that's what Davies is doing. To really know how far the Israelites could get in 11 days, during 11 day times, you need to assemble 30 or 40,000 people, have half of them be women and children, and then add thousands of head of goats, sheep, cattle, and etc., and then have a go at it. That's what you need to do. You're not getting very far, to be honest, because you're going to have to be stopping to water the flocks. You're going to have to be stopping at places. I mean, people can carry water. You're not going to be carrying water for flocks. I mean, like everybody's got, 50 pounds of water on them? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So Davies' calculations, while they might on the surface seem impressive, do not conform to the conditions that we're dealing with the Exodus travel. Secondly, he also assumes that Seir and Edom are not the same area. He's aware of some of these verses, obviously, in the article, but then he'll gravitate to places where Seir is like a different place or a neutral term that doesn't overlap with Edom, and then he'll say, see, we got to keep them separate. And then he'll talk about the ones where they're obviously together, like the March from the South passages we read. Then he'll say something like that they were put together, because of sources. I mean, he does the source critical tango to divorce Seir and Edom from the equation that he uses. Yeah, I just don't think it's a legitimate method. Frankly, I don't think Deuteronomy 1-2 really helps us at all. I don't think it helps resolve anything, and it doesn't really help. I think that the whole point is that it took us 11 days from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir, okay, to get to Kadesh Barnea. Again, it's not like you can make a coherent calculation from that, because we just don't have the parameters to do that. So I wanted to mention that just in case some of you read that. So we're here at the end of our episode, and we're going to come back to some of these things later when we get to the Sinai scenes of Exodus. But I wanted to, again, say some things about, especially in this episode, the need for honoring both Exodus 3 and Exodus 17 and the March from the South traditions. We need to not blunt or ignore or dismiss or dichotomize, one set of data from other points of data. These things need to be and can be understood together. And again, if you care to do that, and I do, and again, hopefully you understand why at this point, because those passages about the March from the South they are explicitly connected to Sinai and Midian, Exodus 3. I mean, they just are. So we have to take these things in tandem to sort of frame a picture of what's going on in Exodus 3:1 and in these other passages, where Moses is at. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you care to do that, you either have to do what Davies does and just say, "Oh, these don't matter. They're later, or they're the result of some editorial snafu or whatever. We're not going to count them." You basically either cheat, or you try to, again, honor all of the data. And if you do that, I don't see how the traditional location of Mount Sinai can work. And I also don't see how Jebel al-Lawz works. I think we're dealing with a different location that, frankly, my answer is we don't know. We don't know where Mount Sinai, which mountain it was. We just don't know. And at this point, Jebel al-Lawz, there's like burnt tops of the mountain, and there's evidence for volcanic activity. So what? Why do we think we need a volcanic mountain? See, people assume that because they want a natural explanation to the fire of God's presence on Sinai. Frankly, if you're a theist, you don't need a natural explanation for the fiery presence of Yahweh on a mountain. You don't. But somehow, this naturalistic explanation is adopted by defenders of Jebel al-Lawz when they would reject it for the plagues or some other miracle or something like that. It's just at this point, it helps them make the argument for the location that they want. And what I'm here to say is I believe that's inconsistent and frankly unnecessary. And well, what about those pictographs of cattle? They like when the Israelites, when Moses was up on the mountain, they made a golden calf, and boy, we've got pictures of calves, at Jebel al-Lawz. And supposedly other sacred. I mean, I've seen the pictures. I don't really see some of what I'm told I'm seeing. And again, I'm aware of all these. But, have those pictographs been dated? There are experts. God forbid I would be one of them. Thank the Lord I'm not. But there are people who spend their entire lives studying rock art in Saudi Arabia and, of course, other places in the world. And there are ways to date these things. So my first question is always, well, those pictographs that you say are proof of the the events of the Exodus, and this is Mount Sinai. Where's the dating analysis of them? I can tell you right now at Jebel al-Lawz, again in the promotion of this, and I used to like this theory until I realized it, really until I saw the problems that were associated with it. as I went on. For a long time, I've not believed in the traditional site, and I like the Jebel Allah site for years. But then when you really drill down into it, especially the Yahweh from the South traditions and a few other things we'll talk about when we get to these other episodes on Exodus 3, it has serious problems. Even Paul's reference in Galatians 4 to Mount Sinai in Arabia. I hate to just, again, pour water on this, but there's a text critical issue there. It may not even be in the original text. Okay, I mean, there are just things like this that when you drill down, you realize how uncertain they are. And Arabia, again, is a vastly elastic term anyway in the first century period, Greco-Roman, understanding. There's just so many things that can go wrong. So many things that are assumed and not proven. And the pictographs is just another in a long list of these things. Where's the date for them? Can we date those things? Did you even check? And please don't bring in, Ron Wyatt at this point about the Egyptian chariot wheels, near this or that crossing and whatnot. And frankly, you can still have, a Nueva crossing or whatever, some other kind of crossing. That really isn't the issue, because the Israelites could have kept going, into the area where, we're looking at. They could have crossed something at the tip of Aqaba. I mean, who cares, But if you're depending on Ron Wyatt data, you're just not wise. Okay, his stuff has never been tested. It's never been pulled out for testing. We have shapes of things that may or may not be Egyptian chariot wheels. And I also hope you realize that Egyptian chariot wheels, the design of them differed in different eras. Okay, and there ought to be hundreds of them, not just 2 or 3. And they're probably not chariot wheels to begin with, but again, I digress. Again, if you really want to prove it, pull one out and have it dated, have it tested, have it analyzed. But Wyatt and others just simply don't do this stuff. Or they'll claim to have found something that's now disappeared. The dog ate my, inscription. The dog ate this, the dog ate that. The Saudis took it, the Saudis stole it. Well, that's convenient. Again, you've got to do better than that. I mean, especially as Christians. As Christians, if we want to do this kind of research, especially if there's an apologetic bent to it for some reason or along some trajectory, you just have to be more honest than this. You just have to be. Because if it's easily underminable by very simple, straightforward, frankly, very obvious questions. Hey, do we have a date for that specimen thing? Do we actually have it here? We can look at? If it's always no and it's missing, the arguments are no better than the kind of stuff that you get with ancient aliens talk. Now that might sound harsh, but honestly, that's where it's at. I meet people all the time, through email mostly, that will show me things where people belittle faith in Christianity because of poor scholarship and the poor reasoning that Christians do in areas like this. And yeah, I'll grant you that the atheists, they do a lot of poor reasoning too. They have a lot of poor scholarship too. But my point is that we shouldn't. So I'm hoping, again, that you see the complexity of something as simple as Exodus 3:1. And now you may have a new thing to factor in. The Yahweh from the South traditions. Again, these are all important. They are all in Scripture. They are all pertinent to the same events, the same issue as far as Yahweh and the knowledge of Yahweh in a given geographical part. They're all important. Again, we need to honor all of the data and struggle with it. And that's what Bible study is about. That's what Bible study is about. It's not about looking for quick answers and proof texts. And if that's what you want, you're not really doing Bible study. You're doing something else, and it could turn around and bite you in the theological butt, or it could, have a worse effect when, again, people aren't willing to listen to you about something that really is important, like the gospel, but you have not gained a hearing with them because of poor research in some other area. And that's a shame. It's a shame that those two things get married in the minds of some people, but they do. So we need to, again, be a little more circumspect about this. And as the next episodes we have on Exodus 3, parts 2 and 3, again, we'll get down into some more of these details and then even more. Again, we're not done with Sinai once we get out of Exodus 3, trust me. Some of these other issues, some of the things we talked about even today will come back into our discussion. But again, I'm hoping that you see the complexity, but also, again, get an appreciation for what's a distraction and what's not, and the need, again, to do good research.
You teased us last week about maybe connecting some dots to some watchers, so please tell me that's the case.
Yeah, I know. There's going to be some odd stuff in here, so, that's what people pay us for.
They do? They do?
Oh boy. No, I guess that's why they listen.
Okay.
I hope they listen for more reasons than that. Well, yeah, we are in Exodus 3 still. Last time we did the whole Midian thing. What's this about Midian and Horeb, in Exodus 3:1, and we tied that into the Yahweh coming from the south traditions in the Hebrew Bible in 4 or 5 passages. So I'm assuming if you're listening to this now, you have listened to that, because I'm not going to repeat that. And I'm going to build on what we did last time. So if you have not listened to part 1, you need to do that, or some of the stuff here is going to be lost on you. But we want to focus this time on the Kenite. That's Kenite, the Kenite hypothesis. And since the Kenites, as a people, kind of obscure in the Old Testament, are tied to the lineage of Cain, it's kind of interesting to, take a rabbit trail, a sidebar in the second half toward how the book of Enoch looks at the genealogy of Cain, and specifically in relationship to linking Cain, to evil and the Watchers and so on and so forth. So we're going to do 2 things in this episode. We're going to talk about the Kenites and the Kenite hypothesis, explain what that is and what the implications are, at least how they're perceived. And then the second part, we're going to do some of the Enochian crossover here into the lineage of Cain. I think you'll find it interesting. I think you'll find both parts interesting, actually. So to jump in here by way of introduction, what is the Kenite hypothesis? This goes back to the late 1800s, when a few scholars sort of drew attention to the Kenites and their lineages and how it overlaps with Midian, the Midianites. And then, of course, that takes you into an overlap with Moses and Jethro and all the things we talked about in part 1. And once you do that, it raises a question about, well, is it possible that Moses, I mean, I'm going to use critical scholar speak here, okay? Scholars who, and when I say critical, I'm not referring to critical thinking, because all scholars, hopefully, will use critical thinking. But critical scholarship is typically one that does not have a necessarily high view of Scripture and is probably non-confessional. They don't assign any concept of inspiration, for example, to the text. And that's especially true when critical scholarship starts to come into its own, the late 19th century, early 20th century, and so on. It was about, again, around that time, late 19th century, that a few scholars raised the question based upon the Kenite, Midianite, Moses connections. Well, in view of the fact that Moses apparently, that's an important term, we're going to hit this next episode, apparently did not know the name of Yahweh. We get that from Exodus 6:3. Typically, the way it's translated, it's pretty explicit there, where God says to Moses, "By my name Yahweh, I did not reveal myself to them," to the patriarchs. And then you get Exodus 3, where Moses says essentially, "Hey, what's your name?" In his conversation with God, and God says, "I am that I am." Okay, and this is where the divine name comes from. So, certain scholars raise the question: well, maybe the Midianites worshipped Yahweh before the Israelites did, and Moses had to learn Yahweh religion from Jethro and from the Midianites and from the Kenites. Now, this sort of picked up steam later on when there were a couple of archaeological discoveries that did locate the divine name in artifactual evidence in these areas, these geographical areas where the Midianites and the Kenites come from. And so the Kenite hypothesis has sort of been I don't know if it's probably overstated to say it's a big deal, because there are a lot of scholars who don't buy it because they don't think Moses was at all historical. So that just sort of throws the whole thing out the window from the get-go. But it's still something that gets talked about in biblical scholarship. So by way of a sort of a well-written definition or overview, I'm going to read from Harper's Bible Dictionary here about the Kenites to get us into this whole, what is this hypothesis? How does it work? And HBD says the Kenites are an ethnic group listed among the pre-Israelite inhabitants of the land of Canaan. So again, prior to the conquest, that means that there were people in the land called Kenites. Okay. Their name, continuing with HBD, their name is popularly derived from smith, as in like blacksmith, Hebrew Kayan, Kenite. Okay, you can hear the similarity there. A theory supported but not proven by the fact that the Kenites lived in northern Sinai, a region of copper mining and smelting in ancient times. Then he gives the reference of Numbers 24:17 through 22. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, or Hobab, a priest of Midian, is identified in Judges 1:16 and Judges 4:11 as a Kenite. I'll read you Judges 1:16. The descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negev near Arad, and they went and settled with the people. Let me just look up Judges 4:11. We can read that one as well. We might as well since we're here. Judges 4:11. Now Heber, the Kenite, had separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses. Okay, that's the first part of the verse. So it's pretty explicit, pretty clear that you've got, again, the priest of Midian, Jethro, who's, part of the Kenites. Well, of course, Moses marries into that family in the Exodus story. So back to HBD. In view of the fact that Moses first encountered Yahweh in the service of the priest Jethro, and since Jethro later blessed Moses and offered sacrifice to Yahweh and instructed Moses regarding delegation of authority, this is Exodus 18, it has been speculated by some scholars that Moses learned Yahwism from the Kenites, the so-called Kenite hypothesis. The evidence, however, is not adequate to support this view. So let me just stop there. HBD, again, is being honest with us that there are a lot of people who just don't buy this. And again, we'll get into sort of why, for what reasons they might not. Continuing with HBD, some Kenite families evidently accompanied the Israelites to the plains of Moab, for the descendants of Moses' father-in-law, the Kenite, went up from the city of palms, presumably Jericho, with the men of Judah to live among the people of the wilderness of Judah in the Negev near Arad. That's Judges 1:16. One Kenite family from this Negev community, Heber and his wife Jael, or Yael, it's Jael in English, migrated north to settle in Zaananim, near Kadesh, probably just northeast of Mount Tabor. And Jael subsequently killed Israel's enemy Sisera in her tent. This is the famous story in Judges 4 and 5. In Saul's campaign against the Amalekites of northern Sinai, he sent word to the Kenites to separate themselves from the Amalekites. Saul wanted to spare the Kenites since they had shown kindness to all the people of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. Okay, so that's 1 Samuel 15:6. And so when Saul is going to campaign against the Amalekites, he tells the Kenites to get out of Dodge because he perceives the Kenites, again, as being kind to Israel when Israel came up out of Egypt. So even Saul knows at this point that there's some relationship between the Kenites and the Israelites. Now, I want to also quote a little bit from an article, and I'll put this in the protected folder. Marlene Mondrian, her article is entitled "Who Were the Kenites?" This is from Old Testament Essays, Volume 24, Number 2, in 2011. She writes, the Kenite hypothesis postulates that Moses was introduced to the cult of Yahweh before he was confronted by Yahweh from the burning bush. Scholars in support of the Kenite hypothesis advance that these nomadic peoples from the regions south of Palestine venerated Yahweh even before tribes migrating or escaping from Egypt were introduced into the cult of Yahweh. And by the way, as I mentioned before in the podcast, when you read the word cult in scholarly literature, you can substitute the word worship. Okay, that's all it means. It's not like a cult like we think of, but cult refers to ritual acts. So the worship of Yahweh. Back to Mondrian. In Numbers 24, 21 to 22, the name Cain is specifically associated with the Kenites. Now, that's going to be important. Again, Cain is associated with the Kenites with Cain. Scholars have identified the Cain narrative of Genesis 4 as the possible etiological legend of the Kenites. Etiological is a word that means point of origin. And Cain, they've identified Cain as the eponymous ancestor of these people. In other words, the ancestor whose name they bear. Continuing with Mondrian, although presently not so much in the forefront of scholarly debates, the question of the origin of the Yahwist religion of the Israelites has as yet not been resolved. Scholars have thus reached no consensus regarding this contentious matter. So again, that's a nice way of saying, hey, this is a debate within scholarship. Now, there are questions raised in brief from those short summaries. I want you to be thinking about these questions. Is it coherent to say that Moses got Yahweh religion from the Kenites? Okay, that's question number one. Question two, is it coherent to say that the Kenites introduced the worship of Yahweh to Moses? And third, are the Kenites scripturally and etymologically connected to Cain? So those are three questions to sort of have in your head as we start here. I'm going to propose some other questions about what the implications of certain answers might be, for a person like, the people who listen to this podcast, those of us with a high view of Scripture. Does any of this matter? And I'll propose a few questions, momentarily here related to those kinds of issues. So just so we understand, though, when scholars raise these questions, they are not just fabrications. Okay, they're not just sitting there at their desks thinking, well, how can I call the Bible into question? What can I sort of suck out of my thumb, to make the sort of the face value story of the Old Testament to make that appear like it's not what it's supposed to be. That's not what they're doing here. These are questions that arise from the text. Specifically, the questions are raised by Exodus 3, which is the revelation of the name, the divine name to Moses in the region of Midian associated with the northern Sinai Peninsula, the area of Paran, Timan, Edom, again, where certain biblical passages have Yahweh coming from. And Habakkuk 3:3-7, like we saw in the last episode, specifically loops Midian into that complex of ideas and that geography. There's also Exodus 6:3. Again, the way the verse is usually translated, it seems clear that Moses had never heard of the name of Yahweh. So that generates, this issue, this question. And thirdly, there is ancient material that shows the name Yahweh was known in the area of Edom and Midian. Now, as we talked about last time, these texts date to the 1300s BC or the 1200s BC, either nearly a century earlier than the time most scholars have the Exodus. Remember the late dates in the 1200s? So if you're taking the late date, which most scholars do, and you find an inscription, an Egyptian text, that has the name Yahweh in it, and that's going to raise questions. Well, they're not in the land yet, because one of those Egyptian inscriptions specifically situates, Yahweh, or of the Shasu Bedouin in the land of Yahweh, in Seir, which is again one of the place names where Yahweh comes from the south. Seir, Edom, Paran, Timan, this area. So if you look at that evidence, you're going to be thinking, good grief, it looks like Yahweh was known earlier than the Exodus and not by the Israelites. I mean, it's a very logical question to ask. So again, they're not sitting there at their desk just thinking up ways to, justify tenure or something. Okay, these are real questions. Now, just to rehearse the DDD evidence a little bit more, there are two Egyptian texts. I'm going to read again from DDD like I did last time. There are two Egyptian texts that mention Yahweh. In these texts, again, 1300s, 1200s, Yahweh is neither connected with the Israelites, nor is his cult, again, his worship, located in Palestine, Canaan. Okay. The texts speak about Yahu in the land of the Shasu Bedouins. The one text is from the reign of Amenophis III, that's the 1300s, and the other from the reign of Ramses II, that's the 1200s. In the Ramses II list, where this place name occurs, the name occurs in a context which also mentions Seir. It may be tentatively concluded that the Yahoo in the land of the Shasu Bedouins is to be situated in the area of Edom and Midian. Again, this is why it's a question. Now let's get into the data here about the Kenites themselves. Now, Mondrian writes this in her article. The Kenites were a nomadic or semi-nomadic tribe of coppersmiths. Just hold that thought in your head, coppersmiths, people who work with metal, okay, who inhabited the rocky country south of Tel Arad, which was an important city in the eastern Negev. As early as the 13th century BCE, they made their livelihood as metal craftsmen. Scholars have identified the Cain narrative of Genesis 4 again as the possible ideological, reference point to this. Now, if I go back to the HBD article, okay, remember that I read this line earlier. The Kenites are an ethnic group listed among the pre-Israelite inhabitants of the land of Canaan. Their name is popularly derived from smith, okay, like a blacksmith, or again, someone who works with metal, Hebrew kain. So what we have here right off the bat in the name Kenite, which is spelled in Hebrew characters, I'll just give you the English letter names, Q-Y-N-Y. The name is Q-Y-N, Kayin, and then the Y on the end is called in Hebrew grammar a gentilic ending. You'd stick that little consonant there to turn a name into a people group. Okay, that's essentially what gentilics are. So you have Q-Y-N, Y ending Kenites. The name Cain is exactly the same minus the gentilic ending. It's Q-Y-N, Kayin. So again, people who are working in the Hebrew text, they notice this immediately. Now, Rick Hess, and again, we interviewed Rick back at our series of SBL interviews, and Rick's specialty is actually personal names in ancient texts, not just Hebrew, but in Canaanite, Amorite. He has a number of books and articles specifically on personal names and topographical, place names. This is his thing. So in Anchor Bible Dictionary, Hess wrote the article on Cain, and he writes this. Cain appears in Genesis 4 as the murderer of his brother Abel and as the progenitor of a line credited with the initiation of various aspects of culture. The name recurs in the Oracle of Balaam at Numbers 24:22 in a difficult text which associates Cain, with the Kenites, again, Q-Y-N-Y. The name of Cain has its etymological root, Q-Y-N, which does not appear other than in proper names and gentilics in biblical Hebrew. A similarly spelled root occurs in South Arabian. Okay, there we go. South Arabian personal, clan, and tribal names as early as the 5th century BC. And so we have a bit of a chronological disconnect there, but this is where you get this kind of naming terminology in that part of the region. A QYN root occurs in later Aramaic and Arabic with the meaning of smith, again, someone who works with metal. Furthermore, a similar root appears in the gentilic with which the Balaam oracle associates the name Cain and Kenites. These people appear in the biblical text as smiths associated with the desert area of Israel's wanderings. Okay, so there again, this is all biblical data. Hess concludes with this line here. Compare Tubal Cain, the last mentioned figure in the line of Cain. He not only possesses Cain's name, but he is also described in the verse as a smith. Again, someone who works with metal. So, again, the biblical data are there. Back to Mondrian. Mondrian, again, just a brief note here. She says, according to Exodus 3:1, which is, again, where we're parked, and Judges 1:16, there is a clear connection between the Midianites and the Kenites. Exodus 3:1 refers to Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, as a priest of Midian, while Judges 1:16 names him as a Kenite. Cain and the Kenites are also linked in Judges 4:11. Where Heber the Kenite is said to have separated from Cain, he's also identified with the sons of Hobab, the Kenite or Midianite, the father-in-law of Moses. So it really seems, again, that the biblical data are pretty clear as far as these connection points anyway. And the location of the Kenites, again, in the southeast, on the border of where Judah would be in the south of Canaan, right there, where if you're under, again, the Dead Sea, when you start to move under the Dead Sea, you run into Edom. So there's this fuzzy border again. And of course, south of Canaan, this is the region of Timon and Paran. And we saw last week, again, in Habakkuk 3, that this sort of area is still connected with the Midianites, in some way. Again, you get this picture that all of these things converge again. And so once this archaeological data was discovered, with again, since most scholars take the late date of the Exodus, when you have Yahweh specifically said by an Egyptian to be a place name that includes the name Yahweh in this area, in the time of Ramses, okay, then you have to wonder, because even if, let's just say I'm a late dater and I think the Exodus happened in the reign of Ramses. Again, there are problems with that. We've talked about them in several episodes already, but let's just throw it out there. Let's say the movie Ten Commandments, that's the right thing. It's still only going to be much later before the Israelites actually get into the land. I mean, you have to have the conquest. I mean, you at least have an encounter with Moses, but when you read again the biblical text at face value, when Moses shows up in Midian and he meets Jethro and of course his daughters, it's like they already know this. They already know the name Yahweh. So what Ramses, whoever wrote this text is from the time of Ramses, it would seem that this was already a place that the Egyptians knew too. The Egyptian army and Ramses aren't in Exodus 3. They're not scouting out Midian and run into the name of Yahweh. It's already there. So again, these things just create these questions. So our sources, again, at least biblically, seem pretty clear to create these associations. But I've already mentioned that some scholars just don't buy, into the connection. So we ought to say something about why before we go any further. It seems kind of obvious. So why would this be a debate? We'll take out the whole, chicken or egg, did Moses know Yahweh theological question, if it even is a theological question. We'll get to that in a moment too. But let's just put that to the side of the table here. If we're a bunch of scholars and we don't really care, if what we think conforms to, the Bible alone, or, we don't have a high view of Scripture, something like that, okay? And we're just looking at the data. Why would anybody doubt it? The hypothesis anyway. Well, fundamentally, some scholars doubt, and here's a key word, they doubt a historical connection between the Kenites and Cain. They say, yeah, I know the Bible, there's a Bible verse for that. But they don't consider Cain real. They don't consider Moses real. And so they just think that the verse is kind of made up. They don't consider any of this historical. They believe the biblical writer just heard the same sound between, the literary name Cain, and then ran into some Kenites and heard their name or knew the people group name, and just sort of made up a connection in the biblical text. They don't think any of it's historical. It's just literary and made up. So that's why they don't really care about the hypothesis. They don't put any stock in it in terms of real history. And some of them even doubt that the Yahweh references in Egyptian texts. They think that, okay, there's a place and it has these consonants in it, YHW. That doesn't mean there was a religion of Yahweh there. You can't just take the occurrence of a name and say there's a whole system of worship there. And they're right on that point. You really can't do that. You can't take a place name and assume that there's a deity there who's worshipped and has a priesthood and a cult. That exaggerates, that way overstates the data, because the data is like two texts, okay? And only one of them actually puts them in seer, okay? So they're right. I mean, the people who are doubting this are right at this point. They just don't think there's enough data to make these connections. Plus, they don't consider it, historical anyway. And so they just don't assign a whole lot of importance to it. Who cares if the Kenites come from Cain? The Hebrew Bible is still pretty clear. The Kenites were related to the Midianites. And so the Yahweh from the south of Canaan stuff, Seir, Edom, Paran, Timon, these scholars would say, well, that's still valid. I mean, because there's other things going on here in this Yahweh from the south tradition. That's pretty obvious. But why do we have to come up with this Kenite hypothesis about where the worship of Yahweh comes from? They'd argue that where our attention needs to be, again, is in the general Yahweh from the south stuff, and not really obsessing about which people group, told Moses, again, because they don't believe there was a Moses. We don't really need to care about distractions like this. Let's just look at the Yahweh from the South traditions and go from there. Now, I'm going to illustrate for you kind of how this works. And I'm going to quote from Vander Toorn's article in DDD. This is his article on Yahweh because it spends some time on the Kenite thing. And you'll just see how Vander Toorn is a guy who he knows all the data. He's not going to be a believer in the historicity of Moses. I mean, I don't want to say for sure that I know that, but I've only met the guy once, but so I can't really tell. But if he's sort of a mainstream European scholar, that 9 chances out of 10 I'm going to be right here. He doesn't assign historicity to Moses, but he recognizes all the data. So how would he talk about this? Okay, and that's what the DDD entry, at least this part of it, is good for. Just how do they think about this? So he writes, before 1200 BC, the name Yahweh is not found in any Semitic text. That's true. Yahweh was not known at, it's true if you exclude the Bible, okay? Yahweh was not at Ugarit either. I get email questions about this all the time. What about, Yahweh came from the Ugaritic stuff and Ugarit? No, he didn't. Okay, he just didn't. There's like one guy in the world who claimed this, and I think is still alive. Nobody buys that. All right, and this is a good example. Vander Toorn is not an evangelical Bible believer that thinks the Bible's inspired. He thinks that's just silly. Okay, so let's jump back in here. Yahweh was not known at Ugarit either. The singular name YW, vocalization unknown, in a damaged passage of the Baal cycle cannot convincingly be interpreted as an abbreviation for Yahweh. The earliest West Semitic text mentioning Yahweh, again, except for the biblical evidence, is the victory stela written by Mesha, the Moabite king from the 9th century BCE. That's the Moabite stone. The absence of references to a Syrian or Palestinian cult of Yahweh outside Israel suggests that the god does not belong to the traditional circle of West Semitic deities. The origins of his veneration must be sought for elsewhere. A number of texts suggest that Yahweh was worshipped in southern Edom and Midian before his cult spread to Palestine. Again, Palestine is politically correct terminology for Canaan here, for Israel as a land. There are 2 Egyptian texts that mention Yahweh. In these texts from the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, Yahweh is neither connected with the Israelites nor is his cult located in Palestine. Again, we read those before. So he says here, in these texts, YHW is used as a toponym, place name. Yet a relationship with a deity by the same name is a reasonable assumption, but whether the god took his name from the region or vice versa remains undecided. By the 14th century BCE, before the cult of Yahweh had reached Israel, groups of Edomite and Midianite nomads worshipped Yahweh as their god. He's saying this is apparently what's going on. These data converge with a northern tradition. North of Edom and Midian would be in Canaan proper. Okay, these data converge with a northern tradition found in a number of ancient theophany texts, according to which Yahweh came from Edom and Seir. Judges 5, Psalm 68, Deuteronomy 33, Habakkuk 3. Again, we've been over all this turf. All of those places in those passages, Vander Toorn writes, Seir, Mount Paran, Timon, and Sinai are in or near Edom. If Yahweh was at home in the south then, because Edom is south of Palestine or Canaan, how did he make his way to the north? Like how did it, if it started here, how did it migrate north? According to a widely accepted theory, the Kenites were the mediators of the Yahwistic cult. In its classical form, the hypothesis assumes that the Israelites became acquainted with the cult of Yahweh through Moses. Moses' father-in-law, Hobab, according to an old tradition, was a Midianite priest who worshipped Yahweh. In Exodus 18, Exodus 3, all that stuff. He belonged to the Kenites, Judges 1:16 and 4:11, a branch of the Midianites. Now, Vander Toorn says the strength of the Kenite hypothesis is the link it establishes between different but converging sets of data. The absence of Yahweh from West Semitic epigraphy, inscriptions, Yahweh's topographical link with the area of Edom, which may be taken to include the territory of the Midianites, the Kenite affiliation of Moses, and the positive evaluation of the Kenites in the Bible. So he says, all that makes sense. Then he adds, a major flaw in the classical Kenite hypothesis, however, is its disregard for the Canaanite origins of Israel. The view that under the influence of Moses, the Israelites became Yahweh's during their journey through the desert, and then brought their newly acquired religion. That's questionable. I hope you're following there. It could, because it intentionally separates Yahweh from who the Israelites were worshiping while they were slaves in Egypt. But again, that's mainstream scholarship. They're going to say that El and El Shaddai, El this and that, in the patriarchal narratives of the Bible, that was a different deity than Yahweh. Okay, because again, they're assuming polytheism here. They're assuming lots of things. So let me repeat that sentence of Vandertorm. The view that under the influence of Moses, the Israelites became Yahweh's during their journey through the desert and then brought their newly acquired religion to the Palestinian soil neglects the fact that the majority of the Israelites were firmly rooted in Palestine. The historical role of Moses, moreover, is highly problematic. It seems more prudent not to put too much weight on the figure of Moses. It is only in later tradition that he came to be regarded as the legendary ancestor of the Levitical priests and a symbol of the Yahweh alone movement. His real importance remains uncertain. If the Kenite hypothesis is to be maintained, then it is only in a modified form. It's highly plausible that the Kenites and the Midianites, and he includes the Rechabites, and we didn't even get into them, may be mentioned in the same breath. Perhaps they introduced Israel to the worship of Yahweh. It is unlikely, though, that they did so outside the borders of Palestine. So he's a skeptic, of this. If Yahwism did originate with the Midianites and Kenites, and the evidence seems to point in that direction, it may have been brought to the Transjordan, brought to Edom and these other places by traders along the caravan routes from south to east. You might think, well, that's kind of a wild card. Where does he get that idea? Well, we're gonna bring this passage up a little bit later. He gets it from the Joseph story. Who was it that took Joseph into Egypt? And again, think about where Jacob and his sons were. I mean, they're up north in quote unquote Palestine or Canaan or Israel. Okay, they're in that area, and who is Joseph sold to? The Midianite caravan, the Midianite travelers, also called Ishmaelites. So what Vandertorn is saying is, look, this is probably how the name Yahweh got into this region. That this is his view. So he's skeptical of the Kenite hypothesis that Yahweh, as a deity, and his worship originated. That's the key word, originated in this area south of Palestine. He doubts that, even though he knows the data is there, and he knows the Bible connects these places with Moses and Midian and all that kind of stuff. He thinks, he's arguing that the name got there by some other means. He's not going to deny that this is consistent with Yahweh coming from the south, and that's an important idea. Even from, I guess, somebody that we'll call, again, I don't know if he's an unbeliever or who knows, who knows where any of these people are at, unless you actually have a conversation with them. But someone who, again, is quite willing, to assign less historicity to this stuff than a lot of people listening to this podcast. But that's still an important point. That's entirely plausible, and that's going to factor into the whole question of Moses learning about Yahweh, from the people in this region, as though he would have had no idea who the God of his fathers and his forefathers was, or that the Israelites down there in Egypt were worshiping some deity, and then they flip deities, they change deity. Oh, we're going to get rid of the El stuff, we're not going to worship the God of Abraham anymore, El Shaddai. We're going to go to this Yahweh, this new one. Okay, if what Vandertorn is suggesting, that this name was circulating around even down into Egypt, the Joseph story, and then winds up in this area, this region, that's significant, because it undermines this notion of a polytheistic deity flipping later on when you get to Moses. So I'm hoping that that rings a bell in your head. So let's try to just wrap up and assess the Kenite hypothesis part of this episode now. For someone who doesn't believe that there was a real Moses or an Exodus, the biblical material about Yahweh from the south, and the external Egyptian material gives them a Yahweh origin explanation. It does that for them. They might complain that it isn't entirely accurate, like Vandertorn did. They might have that complaint. They might see some conflict with other biblical material, maybe something else archaeologically, but they don't care. Who cares? They're not looking to harmonize anything. They're just, they're nuts and bolts, kind of people. They would say the Bible's not accurate on other things anyway, so who cares? But for them, it gives them kind of a working explanation for how Yahweh became known, because he is not. The name is not in any West Semitic text, okay? Any Canaanite, Israelite, that part of the world, north, okay, of Midian and Edom and all that stuff. The Bible, the name Yahweh is not found in any inscription, okay, in that part of the world earlier than the Moabite inscription, which is 900 BC, which is the time of the Omride dynasty, Jehu, that bunch, okay? So you say, well, we have the Old Testament. Yes, we do. That's a literary source. But they're saying, look, if this is just odd. If the Israelites come into Canaan, real early, 1200 for the late daters, 1200 BC, 1400 BC for the early daters, it's kind of unusual. We wouldn't see the name pop up anywhere. Not a seal, not an inscription, nothing. I mean, again, it's thousands of times, in the Bible. But again, for scholars who either don't regard the Bible as a historical text or they don't think it any more significant than any of these other historical texts, this is a chronological oddity to them. So the Kenite hypothesis helps them understand, or at least have a working model for how the name Yahweh would have been known in this part of the world prior to 900 BC. Okay, so that it does that for them. The real question, though, for us is, for those of us who do believe in a historical Moses and who have a high view of Scripture, does the Kenite hypothesis pose a problem? And this takes us to some questions that I think are required for good thinking, coherent thinking about the data we've just covered. In other words, what we want to do is we want to think about the data and ask, well, what do the data say and what don't they say? Because we don't want to just fill in gaps with our imagination. All right, what do they say? What do they not say? And how do we think well about the data that we have? So here are just, again, some questions that are important. Does the Bible, now think about this, does the Bible require that Moses knew the name of Yahweh before he flees to Midian? See, now we assume that as readers and as, in the Christian tradition, what little of the Old Testament actually gets taught to people, most of what people know about the Old Testament they get from movies. I mean, I hate to say it, but that's kind of true. So we assume that of course Moses, he's a little boy. They've got the little basket. And he gets rescued, and it's just a wonderful story. And he gets raised in Pharaoh's household, but he's weaned by his mom, and he knows he's a Hebrew. Of course, he knows about Yahweh. Really? Does the Bible require that Moses knew the name of Yahweh before fleeing to Midian? Okay, Moses is taken from his mother when he is weaned, 2 or 3 years old. He is raised in Pharaoh's household. Now, somehow we aren't told. Again, this is the key idea. What does Scripture actually tell us, and what do we sort of mentally fill in culturally? Okay, we're not told how Moses learned that he was a Hebrew. It's evident that he does know that, because the argument that he breaks up and then he kills an Egyptian. We know the story. Okay, but we're not told how he knows that. And we are never told that he knows the name of Yahweh. How would he? It's not like he's going to Yahweh class, an early release from Egyptian school every day. He's raised in Pharaoh's household. What do you think they're going to teach him? They're not going to teach him about Yahweh. Chances are actually good he would never have heard the name. They're not letting their little boy, their little Egyptian boy now, go off and observe Sabbath with a bunch of slaves. How would he know? I would suggest to you that the Bible doesn't require that he knew it. All that we know that he knew is that he knows he's a Hebrew, and he doesn't like what he's seeing, and he gets in trouble, and he has to flee the country. That's what we know. Second, if Moses did not know the name, again, which is an assumption, but it's not an unreasonable one, does that mean he didn't worship the God of his ancestors? This is kind of in the same bucket. Did Moses know about the God of his ancestors, and did he, like in his heart of hearts, worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? See, we assume that too, to some extent. Well, surely Charlton Heston, would have done, come on. We just don't know. We don't know. We don't know about Moses' spiritual condition or his spiritual knowledge at all until we hit Exodus 3. And God basically punches him in the nose, okay? We just don't know. Third, if Moses didn't know the name Yahweh before the burning bush, does that mean he had no religion at all? I mean, that goes with the second one, with the one we just read. Again, we just don't know these things. The Bible doesn't require all the catch what I'm going to say here. The Bible doesn't require all of the things that critical scholars think the Kenite hypothesis overturns. Say it again. The Bible does not require all of the things that critical scholars think the Kenite hypothesis overturns. It just doesn't. And so this is a manufactured problem on one level. It really is. But again, you don't let, I don't want to cast this like it's a conflict or a fight here, but when you're talking about interpretation of Scripture, do not let your opponent insert details and get you to fight over them when they're not there. Okay, that's what happens in a lot of these debates. Fourth, if the name Yahweh was revealed for the first time to any of the line of Jacob, Israel, for the first time at Sinai, and that would be Moses. Okay, so we're assuming in this question that the slaves in Egypt, they've never heard of the name Yahweh either. Again, based on what Vandertorn says, that may not be true because of the caravans and all that kind of stuff, and Joseph going down into Egypt, and of course, generations later they wind up as slaves. You would think somebody knew this, but let's just go with it here. If the name Yahweh was revealed for the very first time to anybody in Jacob's line, to anybody in Israel, does that mean they were not worshiping the same deity, even without that name? I would suggest to you, no, it doesn't mean that. What it means is that the two lines of Abraham, remember, one's down in Egypt, Jacob. The other line of Abraham through Esau, they're in this Midian, Edom, Seir, Paran area. Okay, that's where they live. You got two lines of Abraham. So what this would mean is that you have one line of Abraham down in Egypt, and let's just assume for the sake of the question, they've just lost everything. They've lost all historical memory, or not all historical memory, but if they ever heard the name of Yahweh, they've forgotten it generations ago, and now they're slaves, blah, 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 blah. And if there's this caravan where you got a few Semites like Joseph, who knew the name, Joseph's memory is history. Who knows about this guy Joseph anymore? And if you know about Joseph, you're not talking about Joseph's knowledge of the name Yahweh. You're talking about the things he did to save people from starvation and whatnot. Let's just assume that nobody down in Egypt knows the name Yahweh. And when the Exodus 3 event is the first time that they hear it, that's only part of Abraham's lineage. Okay, they would have known about their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And maybe they knew, chances are really good here, that they knew of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's God by an El name, El Shaddai, whatever, El Olam, something like that, something in the patriarchal narratives. So that's what they know. But the other side of Abraham's lineage, they would know the name Yahweh. Because that much of the Kenite hypothesis, again, that makes that a plausible argument. So that's really what it would come down to. If this is the first time anybody from Jacob's line hears the name of Yahweh, we can't necessarily conclude that they weren't worshiping the same God, because they both could quite easily be worshiping the same deity of their same forefathers. Both of these lines come from the same source, Abraham. Now, we have it divided after that, okay? You've got Isaac. Ishmael, of course, is the non promised seed. But there are even promises about Ishmael. He'll become 12 princes and blah. They go settle again where the Midianites and all the South Arabia. Okay, is it unreasonable to think that the Ishmaelites would not have known about El or El Shaddai or El, one of these Abraham names for God? It's quite reasonable that they did, because that vocabulary is in South Arabia, and so is the name Yahweh. Again, that's the whole Kenite thing. So it's very conceivable they would have been worshiping the same deity, but with different names, different terminology. Now, this sort of raises a sub-question. Let's say that scenario is the case. We would still wonder, well, why would Abraham's other line, the Esau line, the Ishmael line, or whatever, okay, where would they come up with the name Yahweh? Because they didn't have a burning bush experience. Okay, where does the name come from? Now, in South Semitic, again, languages that are in Midian and Edom and Paran and all these areas, and the Arabian Peninsula, there are a number of possibilities here. And you could read DDD's entry on Yahweh and get all of them. But I think one of the more reasonable is the South Semitic root HYW. It means he blows, and it refers to wind, like a storm. Okay? You could very easily see that the god of the mountain, think of storm clouds over the mountain and lightning flashing, like you would have had in this region. And this is a mountainous region. Again, we read that material last week. You could very easily see that if you're in the mountainous region of Seir, okay, Edom, these places, and you get these storms that come up, and right there, in association with the mountainous area there, that you would think as an ancient person, they're thinking that this frightening weather is caused by the gods or God. And you could very easily see how they could name the god after the windstorm idea. And if they did, there you have the consonants right there in South Arabia. Now we know when Moses has his encounter, again, Moses is from the other half of Abram's lineage, okay, in our little, sort of thought experiment here. Moses is from the other half, and he gets confronted, and in West Semitic, in Hebrew, it doesn't mean he blows. That's a different language. It's a Semitic language, but it's a different, it's another dialect of Semitic. In Hebrew, it means to be. It's from the to be verb, just like Exodus 3 tells us. So at that point, they're both worshiping the same deity who has the same name, even though, in this scenario, the etymology, the derivation of the name comes from two different ideas. Again, all of these things are on the table. They are all parts, either collectively or partially, of a coherent explanation that doesn't require the Israelites showing up in Midian behind Moses and saying, well, you want us to switch gods? Okay, we'll do that. And that kind of thinking, even though it's common in critical scholarly circles, overstates the data dramatically. And it fails to consider alternatives that are workable with the data. So we need to be thinking more carefully about this. To leave the thought experiment alone, what I just want to have you go away from or go away with, in this part of the episode is that, look, we have this data, certain people draw certain conclusions from it. And what I want you to realize is that those conclusions are not necessarily valid. And in some cases, they're not necessarily even coherent, because they are either sort of repackaging the data and including some things that aren't really there, or they're just dramatically overstating the implications of the data. And one of the flaws, again, is to assume certain things about Moses that the text never tells us. These are all, in the bucket of silence, when it comes to Scripture, what Moses knew, who knew what and when, and all. Again, these are guesses that are part of Christian tradition, part of Jewish tradition. I mean, they are certainly a part of those traditions. But when you just actually look at the text, you don't get some of those things. And some of those things are important, when you're looking at something like the Kenite hypothesis. I would say none of this material is a threat to those who believe in a historical Moses or the Exodus. We have to remember the Bible describes, what the Bible does describe with respect to these people. Nobody has a Bible, folks. Both sides of Abraham's line have a handful of stories about a deity whom their ancestor Abraham encountered or who encountered him, and they hand down those stories orally. The people of both sides of Abraham's lineage worship his God. This deity had many El names. One of them was El Shaddai, God of the mountains, God of the wilderness. Is it really a stretch to think that one line of descent, from Abraham and the other line that winds up in Edom and Seir and Midian, is it really a stretch to think that one line of descent also described El Shaddai as Yahweh, even if the name that they chose in the South Arabian dialect comes from he blows, the blowing of the wind, again, the storm god? Is that really a stretch? Well, no, it's not. We don't know, how the name, would have developed in one dialect, the other. The Western, Northwest Semitic dialect we get from Exodus 3. We get more information there. We get textual information there. But on the other side, all we have to do is wonder, where they would have come up with that name without the text in their life context. People assign things like weather, like I said, to the power of the gods or God. Moses has his divine encounter with the God of his fathers at the burning bush somewhere near Midian, in the wilderness at a mountain. Okay. Either Moses or the later biblical writer take HWY in South Semitic, maybe they knew about the South Semitic derivation, and they quote unquote convert it to West Semitic Hebrew, where it means to be. Again, that's entirely possible. There we go. You could actually have the biblical writer transforming the Kenite, Midianite, Southern Semitic name to reflect the circumstances of the God who is about to make himself a new nation or people after the deliverance from Egypt, specifically of the other, i.e., the Jacobite line from Abraham that is now released from Egypt. All of this is on the table. It can all make sense, and it can be quite consistent with a historical Moses and an Exodus. You don't need to pick one or the other. So don't let yourself be forced into these sorts of conclusions or be troubled by them. You just need to think better about the material.
All right. Well, I'm excited. What are we going to be talking about today?
It's basically going to focus on how a literate Israelite, again, somebody familiar with their Old Testament and with Second Temple Jewish texts, so a literate person living in that intertestamental period, how they would have thought about, the connections in the Old Testament between Cain and the things that Cain's, genealogy was known for. Things like metallurgy is the obvious connection, but there are other ones. And how intertestamental literature linked that stuff, those marks of civilization, if we will, to the Watchers. So somebody who's familiar with Second Temple material, like books like Enoch and then Old Testament, they're going to wonder, well, why in the world would the guy who wrote Enoch connect Cain to all this? Because aren't the Kenites good guys? I mean, they sort of preserve, the knowledge of Yahweh or the name or something like that. I mean, there's something good going on there with the Kenites. Moses marries into that group. So why this negative connection? How would they have, perhaps thought about what the writers were doing? For this, we need to go back to the genealogy of Cain and the Kenites. Okay. And I'm going to refer to an article. I will put this in the protected folder again. There's an article online. Actually, I wouldn't have to here because this you can actually find online by Philip Esler, E-S-L-E-R. The title of the article is Deus Victor, The Nature and Defeat of Evil in the Book of the Watchers. Now that is a chapter from a book called The Blessing of Enoch, First Enoch in Contemporary Theology. It's published by Wiffenstock. And this particular chapter of it is pages 166 through 190. So Esler, again, I just read you the subtitle, The Nature and Defeat of Evil in the Book of the Watchers. When he's talking about how the Book of the Watchers, which within the Book of Enoch, the Book of the Watchers is chapters 1 through 36, how that material sort of frames the problem of evil. where it comes from and, God's victory over it. In the course of those chapters of Enoch, Cain is a player, okay? And this how the writer of First Enoch sort of deals with Cain is interesting. It's instructive here. And once we sort of see this, we have to wonder if the writer of First Enoch, he would have known biblically about the connection to the Kenites, okay? He would have known that because it's transparently in Scripture. And for us, it gives us some real interesting things to think about because here's the question. If the Kenites are sort of good guys, they preserve the worship of Yahweh. Let's just say that, or they know who Yahweh is. If they're sort of good guys, why in the world would the Bible connect them with a guy as bad as Cain? You say, well, it's because they were metalsmiths. Yeah, I get that. But then if you know the Book of the Watchers material, again, think like a first century Jew here. Let's say you know all this material. You're sitting there thinking, I get that metalsmith thing, but isn't that one of the things that the Watchers get blamed for teaching humankind because it led to self-destruction? So if they're good guys, why do that? Why would the Bible writer do that? Good question. So Essler on page 4 writes this: to appreciate the nature of evil in the Book of the Watchers in a manner that is sensitive to the structure of the work, it is useful to draw a distinction between dramatic time and narrative time. Here, dramatic time refers to the time during which the plot of the work involving the secession of the Watchers from heaven and the description of First Enoch's activities takes place. Narrative time, on the other hand, means the much larger sweep of time that embraces all of the events referred to in the drama of the Watchers in Enoch, which actually extend from the creation to the period of the final judgment and beyond. I mean, Enoch runs the scope from creation to the second earth. I mean, it runs the gamut. Essler adds, it should be noted that the text does not always describe events in strictly chronological order. Thus, the Watchers descend to earth in 1 Enoch 6, again, based on Genesis 6, 1 through 4. But it is not until 1 Enoch 12 that we hear that, quote, before these things, unquote, Enoch was taken, i.e. to heaven, which relates to an earlier period, Genesis 5:24, which is obviously before Genesis 6. This is one of the several signs in the text that the author well understands the broad chronological course of universal and Israelite history, even though he is capable of jumping from one time to the other. On pages 10 to 11, Essler writes, Cain must be understood as the prototypical evildoer on the earth, the first person to engage in what for the Enochic scribe is the worst kind of evil, acts of violence. In the case of Cain, and by necessary implication others after him, homicidal violence. Abel is the first of many to petition heaven on account of this murder. Pages 13 and 14, Essler adds, the next evil in chronological order, after the Cain incident, is that of the Watchers desiring women and wanting to beget children from them, 1 Enoch 6:2. Their leader recognizes this as a great sin. So even the leader of the Watchers, if you actually read Enoch, he admits this is a great sin. When the Watchers do this, they are said to, quote, defile themselves, unquote. The Watchers also, as the story goes on, impart knowledge to human beings. And then Essler goes on to, rabbit trail on that. One of those false teachings was metallurgy, specifically fashioning weapons for war and bloodshed. That was one way that evil would proliferate in the world and destroy the image, destroy the imagers. You destroy humans, the imagers of God. Essler continues after he talks about the false teaching there. But the true horror of the Watchers' secession from heaven emerges only afterward in the actions of their progeny, the giants to which their wives give birth, 1 Enoch 7, 4, and 5. The core of the evil they produce is violence, to the extent of killing and then eating human beings, the creatures of the earth, and even themselves, cannibalism. Thus, violence, initiated by Cain, reappears in a most extreme form with the giants. Now, that's the end of Essler's selections, at least right now. But let's think about this for a moment. In 1 Enoch, Book of the Watchers, that material creates a conceptual link between Cain and the Watchers. The Watchers' crimes, which are various, reach a crescendo in the violence that ensues from their activity. Now here's the question. Is there any indication biblical writers might have been tracking along the same lines? That is, thinking of Cain as some sort of prototypical bad guy, a murderer, and then connecting them with the giants, connecting Cain with the giants, connecting murder, with all that kind of stuff. So is there any evidence biblically that they might have been sort of thinking, biblical writers might have been tracking with this? Like if a biblical writer was here, Moses or whoever of the Torah, and I read him what I just read, would he say, "Oh yeah, we know that, we get it"? Is there any evidence for that? Well, let's think about that. In the Old Testament, Cain's murder in Genesis 4 is of course famous, but who's the next murderer? You ask yourself the question, who's the next murderer? It's Lamech. That's also in Genesis 4, 17 through 24, where we read, Cain knew his wife. This is verse 17, Genesis 4. She conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. Now, I'm going to insert a note here. This is not the same Enoch as in Genesis 5, the one that goes to heaven, okay? That one in Genesis 5 is the seventh from Adam, according to the New Testament and Second Temple literature. Cain's son is obviously not the seventh from Adam in the biblical story, okay? So on to verse 18. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mehujael, and Mehujael fathered Methushael, and Methushael fathered Lamech. And Lamech took two wives. The name of the one was Adah, the name of the other was Zillah. Adah bore Yaval, Jabal in most English Bibles. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Yuval, Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. Zillah also bore Tubal-Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Now, some observations here. First, Lamech is a descendant of Cain. Second, Lamech is a murderer like his forefather, and he even references Cain's crime as some sort of badge of honor. Third, one of the sons of Lamech is Tubal-Cain, the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. Another son was, quote, father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. In other words, people just like the Midianites. HBD, referencing that again, notes, Tubal-Cain is known as a forger of all implements of copper and iron. As descendants of the fugitive wanderer Cain, Tubal-Cain and his relatives, and later the Kenites, typify nomadic tradesmen associated with the rise of urban life and commerce and with the sin and violence it occasioned. That's the end of the HBD quote. Lamech also had another son in chapter 5. See, he has these three sons in chapter 4. Okay, we've got Jubal, Tubal-Cain, but he has another son in Genesis 5:28. Remember who that was? Noah. And so here we go. Here we go with the how do you get Nephilim after the flood question again. Because later on, we're going to have the giants. I mean, think of Enoch now. Enoch, the writer of First Enoch, links the violence of the giants with Cain. Just point blank, it does that. And we've asked the question, well, would biblical writers make those connections? Well, Cain is the prototypical murderer. You've got Lamech next. One of Lamech's sons is Noah. And after, we know what happens with Noah and the sons of God, and they have giants. The giants, well, here we go. Even though the biblical story doesn't have the cannibalism and all that kind of stuff, it does say that the giants were lethal enemies of the people of God. So I'm not saying that this is the best way to look at Genesis 6 and the Nephilim and all that stuff. I'm not saying it's the best view. I'm just saying that you can see the logic. If someone either in antiquity or today wants to create a genealogical line back to Cain to the giants after the flood, you could actually do that because Noah is a descendant of Lamech who is a descendant of Cain. You could actually make that argument. I know a lot of people listening on here, well, Noah was pure in all his generations. Well, And if you actually do a word study on that, it's not the normal word for lineal descendants. This word dor is used of generations as in the people living at your same time, like the generation of the 60s, that kind of thing. Doesn't mean they're all related. It just means they're alive at the same time. Now, in fairness, that word is used one time, in my knowledge, for lineal descent. So I guess it's possible. But one time versus a few dozen other times where it's never used that way or it's not used that way, the odds are against you. And in fact, this is why in antiquity you had some Second Temple Jews gravitate toward someone in Noah's lineage sort of being responsible for the survival in terms of genealogy, the survival of the giants after the flood. This is why they went there. And if you do that, and I'm not saying the writer of First Enoch did, he doesn't spell that out. Again, we don't want to overstate the data here, but he does connect them, at least conceptually. Frankly, I think that's the better way to connect them, these conceptual connections. But anyway, I just want to make the comment here that if this was your predilection, to come up with some like real, biological genealogy, that's your explanation for giants after the flood, and now we've got Noah and Lamech and Cain, and that's the way the writer of Enoch saw it. Well, okay, he may well have seen it that way. Doesn't mean it's right. Just it's a workable thing, at least on a textual basis. Now, again, if that's the way you want to go, you'd have it. Now, this takes us into the genealogies of Genesis 4. And I'm telling you, I know the genealogies are boring, but there's some crazy stuff in the genealogies. if you understand how people were thinking about them. And I'm gonna give you a quote here from Wenham's Genesis commentary on Genesis 4 here. He's writing about the genealogy that we just read, the one that has Cain and Lamech, okay? He says, here the genealogical structure of the account becomes apparent again. Verse 17 could have immediately followed verse 2 had not the long digression about Abel's murder been included at that point. Verses 17 through 24 include several brief comments on the vocations of Cain's descendants, but the only lengthy digression is the Song of Lamech, in which he shows that he has all the violent traits of his forefather. It may be noted that these comments cluster around Enoch and Lamech, the only two men in this genealogy whose names reappear in the genealogy of Adam via Seth, which is interesting. We'll get to that in a moment. Apparently, to make sure that the two Enochs and the two Lamechs are not confused, both genealogies give more detail about these individuals than the others in these lists. For the most part, the other antediluvians remain simply names. The general similarity of the style with the rest of chapter 4 persuades most commentators that, again, we have, without getting into all of Wenham's discussion here, that we've got two separate genealogies. He says parallels with the Sumerian flood story have already been mentioned, again, earlier in his commentary. Mesopotamian sources make occasional mention of 7 Apkalus who lived before the flood. The older texts are not explicit about the precise skills of these Apkalus, but the oldest Apkalu is called Adapa and is associated with Eridu, generally regarded in Mesopotamian tradition as the first city to be founded. Remember the first city in the genealogy, Irad, Eridu, pretty much the same. Okay, so now we're getting into the Apkalu first city traditions in the genealogical line in Genesis 4. Again, you have to think like an Israelite or like a Jewish reader. What were the thoughts they would have been thinking when they read this stuff? Again, if you're a literate Jew, like these scribes were, they're seeing these sorts of connections. Now, Wenham goes on, he says here, he quotes R.R. Wilson, who has a very sort of well-known book on genealogy and history in the biblical world. It's out of print, but you can still get it used on Amazon. Wenham says this: the parallels between Genesis 4:17 through 26 and extra-biblical traditions are not close enough to suggest direct borrowing by Genesis from the extant sources. It's possible, though, that the biblical writer knew these old ideas and wanted to comment on them. He held that technology was a human achievement, not the gift of the gods. Indeed, by linking urbanization and nomadism, music and metalworking to the genealogy of Cain, he seems to be suggesting that all aspects of human culture are in some way tainted by Cain's sin, Now he quotes Wilson. By virtue of being Cain's descendants, the people named in the genealogy all inherit his curse. Thus, the Cainite genealogy becomes part of the Yahwist's account of man's increasing sin, unquote. Again, these are conceptual connections. So if you don't prefer now I've got sort of an argument to make for a literal genealogy back to Cain, through the Watchers and the Giant, all that stuff. If that's not your cup of tea, then how else could we think about this? And again, this is sort of where I'm angling for. This is where I'm at. I think that the material, or thinking about the material, becomes more coherent, it makes more sense. At least it's more textually defensible. If we think conceptually, and that is, follow me here. Cain is the prototypical murderer. Again, we're thinking like a Jew about what we're reading in Enoch and what we know from the Old Testament. And the interface there is Cain. Okay, Cain is the prototypical murderer, the archetypal human agent of chaos after Adam and Eve are driven from Eden. Sure, Adam and Eve fell. They sinned. But Enoch and other Second Temple texts don't have them as the reason for depravity. I've talked about this before on the podcast. That depravity they assign to the Watchers. What the Watchers did is cast as the catalyst for human self-destruction. Cain foreshadows human self-destruction. He typifies the havoc the Watchers and their spawn, the giants, from whom would come demons, would wreak on earth by means of their false teaching, which spread idolatry and, of course, violence. And so these elements, Cain, Watchers, giants, are conceptually and textually connected, even without throwing a literal genealogy into the mix. Maybe a better question to ask is, and here's the relevance to our episode, why the Cainites are made part of this in the Bible. Aren't they good guys? Sure, they descend from the non-elect line of Abraham, Esau, but they still worship the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham. God brings Moses to them to reintroduce himself to Moses, or maybe for the first time. Again, we'll talk about that next week. Why taint the Cainites with Cain? After all, if the Torah was edited during the exile at some point, why would an editor both telegraph the good guy stuff and the, hey, you guys are part of Cain's line stuff? It just doesn't seem to go together. But we have to ask ourselves if we're in fact reading the association with Cain the right way, or whether we're seeing the correct rationale behind the association. Does the biblical writer connect the Cainites to Cain to villainize the Cainites, or is there some other reason that he might be doing it? I would suggest there is another reason, one that you can communicate with one word, and that is reversal. So let's rethink what we've been talking about, starting with the boring genealogies. And on the episode page, I have a map, or not a map, but I have a graphic, a picture of the genealogies in Genesis 4 and 5. So, if you're listening to the episode now and you don't have it, just know that you can go back and look at it. But there's 3 columns in this picture. There's the genealogy on the left-hand side from Genesis 5. It starts with Adam and it ends with Noah through Lamech. Then in the middle, there's Genesis 4, which is the real short fragmentary Sethite line, Adam, Seth, and Enosh. And then on the right-hand column, there's Genesis 4, which begins with Adam and doesn't end with Noah. It ends with Yaval, Yuval, Tubal-Cain through Lamech. Okay? So have a look at that, and maybe you want to re-listen to this, but if you look at the picture, the genealogies actually telegraph some things. And you can add this to the dumpster of stuff you never hear in church. That's basically all we do here, but here we go again. So if you're thinking about the genealogies, Wenham writes this: the 3-member genealogy of Seth, that's the middle one, in Genesis 4, 25, and 26, acts as a trailer to the full 10-member genealogy of chapter 5. It has also been observed that the last 7 members of the Sethite genealogy in chapter 5 parallel the genealogy of Cain in chapter 4, Genesis 4, 17, and 18. To be precise, Wenham says, of the 6 names mentioned in Genesis 4, 17, and 18, 2, Enoch and Lamech, reappear in Genesis 5, 12 through 28. And only Lamech appears at the same point in the genealogy as its penultimate, its next to last member. If, however, Again, Mahalalel changes place with Enoch in chapter 5. And, he says you can line these up just by place name. Doesn't mean they're the same person, but the same place names. Or not place names, but the same personal names if you just flip a few around. They're all kind of there, just different order. But again, doesn't necessarily mean that they're the same people. Except for, Lamech, again, and his kids. That's the interesting point. Now, Wilson, again, that quote where Wenham had quoted Wilson, has pointed out, Wenham says, that peoples often retain variant genealogies alongside each other without sensing any contradiction between them. Certainly, the editor of Genesis did not regard these genealogies as identical or completely identical. Not only do they have different starting points, Cain and Seth, and different conclusions, Tubal, Cain, and Noah, but Enoch and Lamech, the only identical names within the two genealogies, are distinguished by additional biographical details, which show that they were, again, very likely regarded as different people. The morphological similarity of the other names would be explained by, grammatical stuff, assimilation. That's what he's talking about here. He says, comparing the genealogies in the present setting in Genesis indicates the editor saw them as distinct. The different style suggests they probably derive from distinct sources. But this is not to say that they must have first been brought together by an editor, for once again, the Sumerian flood story may have discussed similar topics. Again, so when he talks about topics here, he's getting into this idea that the names in the genealogies, even if they're different, the names convey certain things, certain concepts, certain topics in the flow of primeval history. I would suggest to you something. If you look at the genealogies, here's what's interesting. Just look at them side by side. The left-hand line, you have the good guy. The left-hand column, you have the good guy line. Adam to Noah incorporating Seth. Of course, Seth replaced Abel because Abel was killed. It's a good guy line because it leads to a deliverer. God calls in the days of the flood. Noah. God will preserve humanity through this line. Maybe we should call it the God's plan line. Genesis 4, on the right-hand column, is the chaos line, the bad guy line. It doesn't include Seth. It skips from Adam to Cain on up to Lamech, Noah's father in the other genealogy, but instead of having Noah as Lamech's son, who do we get? Yaval, Yuval, and Tubal-Cain. Tents and livestock, lyre and pipe players, and then the metalworking thing. Big deal, you say. Well, it is kind of a big deal when you realize that those things, dwelling in tents, having livestock, dwelling in cities, that's also in chapter 5 in the genealogical section. It's also in chapter 4 in the bad guy line. Yeah, that's how I want to say it. It's also in chapter 4 when after Cain has to leave, he builds a city, or somebody builds a city. That's a subject for another episode. But the building of the city is also in the bad guy line. All of those things, the formation of civilization, the fashioning of weapons, metallurgy, all that stuff that's interested here, and music is part of what civilization broadly encompasses. All of those things are the stock elements of the Prometheus myth from classical Greece. Remember Prometheus, the Titan, one of the Titans that gives this knowledge, to human beings, and of course it's not viewed as a good thing. They are all elements of settled civilization. So there are actually some scholars, again, this is a rabbit trail we won't take, that wonder if the Prometheus story actually borrows or reflects some of the older biblical and ancient Near Eastern material about civilization, how we get civilization, either the Watchers, the Apkallu, or something like that. But these are the elements of the Prometheus story, which is really kind of interesting. What you have here is you have the good guy line, the line of the plan of God, being set against the line that produces not only depravity and murder and chaos, but also civilization. You say, well, why would that be bad? Why would those things be connected? Think about what it means to pit the genealogies against one another and then loop the Kenites into this. Think reversal. The good guy line marks the line God will use to reverse the bad guy line, the chaos line. In fact, if the Torah links the Midianites back to Cain, it's a bit interesting that those Kenites or Midianites will wind up in territory associated with the non-elect line of Abraham, the Edomites, Esau. The Edomites and Kenites, both on the outs, with God's plan, as it were, wind up in the same area. And it is to that area that God directs Moses to confront him with his mission of not only delivering Jacob's line from Egypt, but of rejoining the family strands back together. Remember, Moses marries into the Midianite line, and plenty of Midianites join the ranks with Israel. God, of course, has been trying to bring the two lines back together and blunt the power of depravity for a long time before we get to Moses. He's been trying to, again, restore the nations. I mean, God called Abraham out of paganism. He divorced the nations, but not so that the nations would be forever excluded from his family. God made a covenant with Abram that through his seed all nations would be blessed, and those nations include places that would later become known as Midian and Edom. They're actually in Genesis 10. They're included in Canaan as a whole place, plus Aram, Uz, and Hol, descendants of Shem, the Semites. Okay, these places are included. They're just not called Midian and Edom yet. Genesis 10's promise even includes the land of a city builder and civilizer, Nimrod. Babylon is not exempt from redemption in God's overall picture. The covenant is a compassionate one. Later, the angel of Yahweh wrestles with Jacob on the eve of his reunion with Esau. It's through Moses, of course, that God gives the law, quote, added because of transgressions, unquote, Galatians 3:19, to restrain human evil until the Messiah would come, die, rise again, and ascend, triggering the coming of the Spirit, the primary agent in believers to reverse depravity, which was in turn laid at the feet of the Watchers in Second Temple Judaism. And when we get to Exodus, God sends Moses into the land of the prodigal line, where God has been present through, though largely unnoticed, for a very long time. It's time to call a man, Moses, whose life's ministry will work to reverse the chaos of the world through the promised plan line of Jacob, the Israelites, whose descendants are supposed to be a kingdom of priests, and through whom the ultimate reverser, the Messiah, will come, and of course the reclaiming of the nations. We even get a foreshadowing of all this. Again, just to summarize all that, if you think about when you pit the line that the good guy line, the line of deliverance, okay, Noah. I mean, we could throw in we could throw in right here the fact that in Jewish tradition, as I've talked about, with Revelation 12, the birth of the Messiah, Jewish tradition had Noah and the one born on September 11, 3 BC, Tishri 1. Jesus and Noah would have shared a birthday. Again, just using Jewish tradition in that. So you have this deliverance line. It's set over against the line of chaos. And the line of chaos actually works its way into biblical history, and the lines converge in the Moses story. The non-elect line of Abraham is there. The Midianites, the Kenites are there. The ones who are linked back to Cain, this awful guy Cain. They're symbols of chaos. Why is civilization? Why is urbanization? Why is human technology and invention viewed as a bad thing, just generally? Because it's not Edenic. It's of human origin. Everything of human origin is less than Eden in biblical thinking. Now, it can be used for good. It can be used for self-destruction. And of course, in the Enochian mind, it's the Watchers that give this to humanity deliberately, intentionally, to encourage the destruction of the image of God, the imagers of God, human beings. So on the one hand, yes, technology, civilization, it's neutral in terms of the way it's used. But in the course of the big picture of the biblical story, it was viewed negatively. It was viewed, again, as something un-Eden, anti-Eden, less than Eden. It just reflects life, not, it's sort of like it's putting in human hands the restoration of Eden. And that is not God's plan. God's plan is to restore Eden through a single person, okay, the Messiah, Christ, the seed of Abraham, who again will unite all nations, and he will unite the disparate strands of Abraham's own family, his genealogy. There's God's method for restoring paradise, restoring utopia, restoring Eden. And then there's everything else. And everything else is of human origin. This is what's working through the mind of the biblical writer, of the Enochian writer, This is how they're thinking about their world and about the whole situation of the world. We have lost Eden. We cannot restore it ourselves. Any attempt to restore it ourselves is going to fail. And in fact, we now, as we learn, as we build, as we do things, we are dependent on our own devices. And if left to ourselves in a non-Edenic world, humanity will turn these things against humanity. I mean, this is our world today. This is our world today. These categories of thought should not be unfamiliar. Everything that humans set their hand to is a two-edged sword. Everything. It's either brought into captivity, to the Lord, or it's not. So they're thinking along these same lines, but they're communicating the ideas through genealogy, through the violence, of the Watchers, through Genesis 6, through books like Enoch, even again, just the simple concept of civilization. It's less than Eden because we're doing it, because God is not doing it. Only when God is at the helm can Eden be restored the way it should be. That is the only path. The power of God is the only path to restore things as they should be, as God originally wanted them. So they're trying to communicate these ideas through, really, again, to us, strange means. These episodes, these stories, genealogies. It's just interesting that when you get to Moses and you get the Kenites, if you're a literate Jew, you know about the Kenites. They're from Cain. Isn't it kind of ironic? Isn't it irony? It's a reversal, okay? Isn't it interesting that God would have Moses go to the place where these descendants are, and that God would use them in some way to save Moses' life, and Moses would become the deliverer. Okay, through him, the knowledge of Yahweh would either be restored or would proliferate itself. Through this man Moses, that the Kenites, the Midianites, are instrumental in saving and preserving, this guy. God is using the unfavored line to do what he wants to do. He is using those who, again, have just fallen by the wayside to accomplish his plan. I mean, it's really a significant theological lesson. And the more you dig down into it, again, you see the ironic reversal of this. And we even get it telegraphed, like in Messianic prophecy. I'll end with this. We get a foreshadowing of this. If you're into the birth narratives of Jesus, I would recommend Father Raymond Brown's book. Raymond Brown was a famous New Testament scholar. He's deceased now. He wrote some massive stuff on the Gospels, and he wrote a really huge book, a thick book, on the birth narratives of Jesus. But he writes this. He says, the gold and frankincense gifts bestowed upon Jesus and his family derive from Isaiah 60, verse 6, and Psalm 72:15. In those verses, those items, gold and frankincense specifically, are associated with the desert camel trains coming from Midian, in northwest Arabia, and from Sheba, the kingdom of the Sabaeans in southwest Arabia. You could add Jeremiah 6:20 to that mix as well. This is me talking now. What about the myrrh? Remember the Ishmaelite, Midianite traders from the Joseph story? Okay, let's read Genesis 37:25 and following, and you're going to hear something interesting here. Genesis 37:25. They sat down to eat, Joseph's brothers, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. Ironic. Coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Okay. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hands be upon him, for he's our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. By the way, Judah says that. Judah winds up, saving his life. Judah, that tribe from which the Messiah would come. His brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Again, I think, back to Vandertorn, I think it's entirely possible that the name of Yahweh does go to Egypt through Joseph. And it comes back and forth. You get these traders, you got Semites running around all over the place. Again, I think what Vandertorn says is really worth considering. I don't know that it solves anything, but it's worth considering. And here you have all the elements. You have all of the elements. In Jesus' day, where does myrrh come from especially? It comes from the Nabateans. There's an Anchor Bible Dictionary article on the Nabateans. You'll get this. They're from South Arabia. It's the same thing as in these other two references. My overall point, again, in the foray to wrap this up, is the guy who wrote First Enoch, a Second Temple Jew, saw the genealogies, again, pitted against each other, God's plan versus chaos. And he saw Cain as a prototypical murderer, the archetypal human agent of chaos. And so that author aligned Cain with the Watchers and the harm they did. New Testament kind of does something similar in 1 John 3 when it links Cain to Satan. My view is that these are conceptual, not literary links, though. And ultimately, the teaching point is that the chaos genealogy expresses the idea that human civilization is invariably anti-Eden or less than Eden. It's human, as opposed to what could have been. So it's a biblical theological rationale that in my mind tells us why utopia always fails. Nothing we can do measures up to Eden. We can't recreate it on our own terms. We can't reverse Babel through our own plans and our own tactics on the way to building our own Eden. Only God can do this, and he inaugurated his own remedy through Christ, who fulfills the law of Moses and the covenants, and is the key to uniting all the lines of Abraham and the nations. So, this is big picture archetypal thinking. And the reason I wanted to include the Enoch stuff in here is there's just stuff lurking around in the Bible that if you read later texts, like Second Temple Jewish literature, they are tracking on ideas that wouldn't normally occur to you. But when you go back, when you listen to their idea, and then you go back into the Old Testament, you think, oh yeah, okay, I see where you could get that. I see why you could connect those dots the way you did. It's just instructive. It's just another way to think about the material. And frankly, we've all wondered, what in the world is Genesis 4 doing in the Old Testament anyway? The whole Cain story seems kind of interruptive. He is an agent of chaos. Lamech is an agent of chaos. What Cain does, even the building of the city, points to the futility, okay? Because Cain does it. The futility of trying to restore order and Eden. Only God can do these things. And again, it's big picture level thinking, but I think, again, for our purposes, it just gets us into it a little bit so that we can understand how people of Jesus' day, again, Second Temple period, how they would have been thinking about their material, their Bible. And in this case, it sort of leaches out to us through a book like First Enoch. Well, let's jump in. I'm going to start by reading Exodus 3. I'm just going to read, for now, the first 14 or so verses, because, again, this is the familiar part of the story everybody thinks of when they think of this chapter in the book. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. So we'll stop there. That's the first 14 verses. And I just want to make a few, sort of sidebar comments on our way to getting to the revelation of the divine name. You'll notice in verse 2, we have the angel of the Lord appearing. The verb there in Hebrew is ra'ah. It is the same verb and stem. Again, I'm not going to rabbit trail into Hebrew stems, but they're important. Same verb and stem that we see in some other passages. Now, if you've read my book, Unseen Realm, you're going to be familiar with chapters 12, 13, and 14, which deal with God in human form in the Old Testament. And of course, this is part of it. The word of the Lord is part of it. The angel of the Lord is part of it. The name theology, the angel, we're going to get to this in Exodus 23, that has the name of God in him. It's another way of saying the presence of God, glory of God is in that particular angel, which is why he's identified with Yahweh. You should be familiar with all that stuff. If you have not read Unseen Realm on these concepts, I would recommend that you do that. Again, I can't really reproduce the book content in episodes, so you're going to have to settle for a bit of a summary here, but that's the place to go. But part of that discussion is, again, God in human form, God appearing. And so you have a verse like Genesis 12:7 that says, Then the Lord, Yahweh, divine name, again, when in your English Bibles, when Lord is in all small capitals, that's the divine name. The divine name is present there in the Hebrew text. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, again, so on and so forth. This is the call of Abram, but it's appeared. And we find out, again, this is connected to the word of the Lord. You get to Jeremiah, where the word of the Lord appears, to Jeremiah. And the word of the Lord is actually called Yahweh in Jeremiah 1. And the word of the Lord reaches out his hand and touches the prophet. I mean, this is God in human form. Even in some senses, some passages, it's a corporeal, encounter where God, touches somebody. You get the same verb and stem here. Genesis 17:1. I'll just read a few of these. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram. Same verb and stem. 18:1. This is Genesis 18. This is when God and two angels show up at Abram's house and they have a meal. Okay, it's God, it's Yahweh in human form. First verse of that section. Genesis 18:1. And the Lord appeared to him, Abram, by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. Again, same verb. Genesis 26:2. The Lord appeared to him. So the same language is used of Isaac and Jacob, other patriarchs. Genesis 35:9. God appeared to Jacob again when he came to Padan Aram and blessed him. Chapter 48. Again, if you've read Unseen Realm, you're familiar with Genesis 48:15 and 16, where the angel and God himself are fused by the grammar. They are co-identified with each other in Jacob's prayer. When he says, may the God of, God who did this, the God who did that, the angel, may he, singular verb form, may he bless the boys. And it's a tight identification of the angel with the Lord. And that chapter begins with, in verse 3, by this statement. Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. Again, referring back to some of these episodes where God showed up as a man in the Old Testament. 1 Samuel 3, kind of a classic instance. The story of the little boy Samuel. When he hears his name called out while they're trying to go to sleep, we find out it is Yahweh appearing and standing. Again, if it's just an invisible, disembodied voice, you don't describe something invisible as standing. How would you know? Samuel is seeing God. Okay, again, in human form. This is anthropomorphic language. This verse here, 1 Samuel 3:21, the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Again, all these verses, and there are more, of course. You can read Unseen Realm about this, but here, again, I think that it's important to point out the language. Luke in Acts picks up on this too. Acts 7:30, in Stephen's speech there, we read, now when 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in a flame of fire in a bush. So Luke, again, is an observant reader drawing attention to an appearance. Again, if you want more detail, you can read Unseen Realm, chapters 12, 13, and 14. You notice as well in verse 2, Exodus 3:2, there's just an interesting sort of comment. Moses looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Okay, and so later on we're going to read that Moses was afraid. At the end of verse 6, he was afraid to look at God. It doesn't say he was afraid to look at the fire. He was afraid to look at God. Again, this is the language of appearance used of the angel in all those other passages, plus this one. This is God in human form in the bush. And Moses is freaked out, as I think we would all be. He's afraid to look at the bush. And again, you're not afraid to look at something invisible because it's invisible. How would you know you're even seeing it if it's invisible? Again, you got to think about the language being used here. It's important. You get to verse 5. This is where God tells Moses, don't come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Again, that is the same language repeated in Joshua 5, where you have the prince, the captain of the Lord's host, shows up, and Joshua sees him. So again, looks just like a man. And Joshua says, essentially, whose side are you on? Are you friend or foe? And then the figure answers him, I'm the captain of the Lord's host. But on the one hand, we don't have the term angel or angel of the Lord in that passage, but we do have two things. One of them is this same language drawn from Exodus 3. The captain of the Lord's host tells Joshua, take your shoes off your feet because you're standing on holy ground. It's exactly the same language. So, and that it's supposed to connect the visible human form of God in Exodus 3 with that guy in Joshua 5. The other thing you have is you have the description in Joshua 5 that the captain of the Lord's host was standing there with drawn sword in his hand. Okay, that is a unique phrase in Hebrew. It's used only two other places in the entire Hebrew Bible. And I talk about this in Unseen Realm as well. And both of those places, it's the angel of the Lord, Numbers 22 and 1 Chronicles 20. So this is, again, the angel of the Lord. This is God in human form. It's not that difficult to see if you're comparing Scripture with Scripture. And again, we know that biblical writers are very fond of, and they're very purposeful, they're very intentional about repurposing parts of the Bible in what they're writing. And they're trying to get you to read something in front of your face and then mentally connect with something else, to essentially connect the dots. And so that's what we're doing here. And again, Unseen Realm is filled with dot connecting of this kind. It's a close reading of Scripture. So again, if you want more detail, you can refer to that. Let's go down to verse 8. In verse 8, we have the statement, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Now, a couple of things here. They're on a mountain, so the coming down, again, has to refer to God coming down from the heavens, again, from the skies. And this is a metaphor for where God would live. He doesn't live on earth. This is not his domain. It's our domain. Okay, it's a domain he created for humanity. He is transcendent. He actually resides, quote unquote. I mean, we have to use the vocabulary of embodiment, which is that's just the way it is, because we're embodied to talk about a being, God, that doesn't have a body, that can be anywhere at any time, at all times at the same time. I mean, so again, we have to think a little bit about the language, but the coming down, again, is a reference to God coming from his place, which again was perceived either as the heavens, the skies, or somewhere that humans don't inhabit. mountains, the oceans. This is where divine beings live. In these places that are not for human residence. That sort of thing. So he comes down, but I think what's really interesting about the "let us go down" that language, I have come down. Then you have Genesis 11. It's the Babel incident. Let us go down. It's the same verb, same Hebrew verb there. So God is coming from the heavens to act. Something's going to happen here when this language is used. And again, it's another little technique of the writers to help readers think about what's happening in the scene they're reading, and again, through similar language, what happened at other times. When God came down, things happened. God is acting. He's busy. He's getting to the task at hand. So it sort of preps the reader for being prepared that God is a God of action, and here we go. So I think that's an interesting thing to observe. As far as the people group names, the Canaanites, the Hittites, and so on and so forth, we're going to wait until I hit probably about Exodus 23 again to get into those names. They're important again, especially as it relates to the conquest and some of those other things. So we'll wait at that point, to do that. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to that I think is really important because of what we've covered in the last couple weeks about we asked the question, had he ever heard of the name Yahweh? Like should this be a shock? And then does that mean he didn't worship the God of his fathers, and so on and so forth. Here we actually have, I think, a pretty good clue as to how we might want to answer that question. We alluded to this earlier in earlier episodes, but here we go. He says in verse 13, then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? Now, I would suggest to you that Moses is not looking for a password here. He's not saying, okay, if I go back to Egypt and go to the leadership there in Israel, I say, or they ask me, okay, you claim to be sent by God. What's his name? In other words, it's not like a password situation. I would suggest to you that Moses is asking the question because he doesn't know. Right? He doesn't know. Otherwise, why would you ask the question? If you knew the answer to the question you're anticipating, you wouldn't need to ask the question. But since he asked the question, and now catch this, the answer is verse 14. God said to Moses, I am who I am. That suggests that the Israelites back in Egypt, they had heard that name before. Now, again, you can go back to the previous episodes and talk about how that might have been. But Moses doesn't know, and that's reasonable for him to not know this name. It's equally plausible that the Israelites back in Egypt did know this name. And if you go back to the prior episodes, this comes up. It's not just me. I mean, there are scholars who aren't theologically at all invested in this that I mentioned last time. Like Vandertorn was one where he says, look, if the Midianites, if the Kenites, had heard this name, these guys are itinerant. They're travelers. They're merchants. They go all over the place, including Egypt. And they're going to be trading not just with Egyptians, but you're going to have Semites down there who are in charge of Egyptian stuff, Egyptian households. They're going to either introduce this name based upon the alternate line, the non-Jacob line of Israel, or this is a name that, again, both lines had heard of at some point. But Moses gets turned over to Pharaoh's household when he's weaned. He's a toddler. He's 2 years old or whatever, and he's raised in Pharaoh's household. It's entirely reasonable that he has never heard this, and he needs the answer. Why else would you ask the question? And again, since God gives him the answer that will satisfy the leadership in Israel or the leadership of Israel back in Egypt, they had to have heard the name. So again, this is going to affect how we think about Exodus 6:3 as we continue. We'll hit that point later on, but it's just an interesting thing to observe here in the text. Another thing, again, this is just a little bit scattershot here, but there are just some interesting things going on. If you look at verse 7, the Lord is the one speaking all this. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, so on and so forth, and I'm going to send you, Moses. And look at verse 12. God, Yahweh, is the speaker, but I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Yahweh refers to God in the third person. Again, this is akin to some of these other things. Again, if you've read Unseen Realm or if you've heard me lecture on the two powers in heaven, this is another one of these passages. Now, one instance of God referring to God in the third person, that's known as Iliism. It doesn't necessarily suggest, a Godhead situation. It depends on the context of the particular passage. It's kind of interesting here, because you do have a second figure in the bush. I don't know how far we can push it in this passage, but there's certainly, again, in the history of Jewish thinking about these sorts of passages, and I talk about this in my Two Powers lectures, that some of these really drew attention and started the rabbinic thinkers down a particular road. And I would say, not just rabbinic thinkers. I'm thinking of Alan Siegel's work there, The Two Powers in Heaven, because after the first century, beginning into the second century, Judaism changed its theology to make the second power idea a heresy. And that's in part, certainly in response to Christians and their idea of a Godhead. But the point is that there was a Godhead kind of thing going on in the Old Testament. And at one point in Judaism, this was fine. If you look at Second Temple literature, the intertestamental period, there's like 8 or 9 different candidates for who the second power is in the literature of that period. It was widely discussed in the Jewish community and was perfectly fine until the Christians came along. Then it was something that needed to be dealt with. But this is just another example of this kind of thing that would stimulate the discussion or contribute something to the discussion. Right here it is in Exodus 3, the Lord referring to God in the third person. It's just kind of interesting. We get to verse 14. Again, here's where we're really going to camp for the rest of the episode in response to Moses' question. If they ask me, what's his name? What shall I say? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Again, this is the revelation of the divine name. Now, Carpenter, in his commentary, has, I think a pretty succinct and helpful summary here of sort of the options, that scholars have come up with as far as what does this mean? Because everybody wants to know what does the name of God mean? Because biblical names, this is pretty common knowledge. Biblical names typically have meanings. Either their constituent parts, form a sentence or something like that, or the name, is a correspondent to some other thing. So what does God's name mean? And scholars have just, this is well traversed territory for anybody really interested. It's kind of a central passage. And you really have more than just that issue. It's not just the meaning, but there's also the issue of the pronunciation. How should God's name be pronounced? So you've got kind of two issues here, but Carpenter, I think, has a decent summary. And here it is. He says, 3 main suggestions have been put forth to pinpoint the meaning of God's name and its proper translation. Number 1, he says, one option stresses the presence of Yahweh. And so there are some scholars who would translate, I am here with you, I will be with you. Carpenter says this is clearly a part of the context. Verse 12 indicates that this narrowing of the name and its meaning is possible. Verse 12, God says to Moses, but I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you. And then that prompts Moses' question. Well, if they ask me what your name is, what do I say? So this idea of the name actually meaning or sort of being focused on presence is one sort of trajectory that has been followed in scholarship. So trying to take the context or take verse 14 and make its context verse 12, this idea of God being with someone. So I am that I am, meaning, well, God is promising to be there. He's I am, and I'm going to be with you. So again, scholars try to connect those two ideas. Second, others have championed something like, quote, I am he who causes to be all that is. I am him who causes to be, unquote. So This, Carpenter says, argues for again, sorry for the grammar speak here, argues for a hifil stem, a causative vocalization of the verbal name phrase. So the name comes, as it's given here, from haya, and we talked about in South Semitic that the root might mean to blow, and so you get he blows, which is a reference to the wind on the top of the mountain, the storm, theophany kind of thing. We talked about that a week or so ago, about it. If you were in Midian and you were a South Semitic language speaker, you might be thinking of that verbal root in association with the YHW or YW name. Okay. On the west side, the West Semitic, when Hebrew is part of this, the root would be the to be verb, haya, which in older Semitic would be hava, HWH versus HYH. They mean exactly the same thing, and they are the exact same thing. Again, without getting into historical grammar, the Y and the W were interchangeable in a number of words in Semitic languages. So if you're looking at it from the West Semitic side, you've got the to be verb. And so the translation in the first person is I am. Okay, I am who I am. But if you go to the third person, now you have something a little bit different, which is this number 2 option about causation. So if you wanted to drill down and get all the nuts and bolts details of this, I'm going to direct you to my website. Go to drmsh.com. Just put it into Google, drmsh.com, and put in YHWH. You're going to find the page where I discuss all this in sort of excruciating detail. But when God answers Moses' question, I am, that is the first person. First person is me. I'm number 1. Okay. First person is I with verbs. I run. I pass. I chase or something. That's first person language. Second person is you. You run. You chase. You pass. Okay. And then third person is somebody else. So it's I, you, and then everybody else. So he. Now in Hebrew, you take a verb like the to be verb, the haya, and the way you express the third person is to stick a Y on the front, a prefix. So now you have YHWH, which is the divine name in the third person. Now, how do we pronounce that? If you use the same Hebrew stem as the first person here, it would be yeh, and it means he is or he will be. The problem with that, though, is in the Hebrew Bible, you have a short form of the divine name, just the first syllable, YH. And it's always with an A vowel, Yah, always. So Yahweh instead of Yeh-weh or Yeh-yeah. Again, the Y and the W are exchangeable in older Hebrew. So if you have an A vowel under the first syllable, there's only one way to sort of account for that grammatically. An A-class vowel followed by an I-class vowel is the hifil. It is the causative stem. And that's why many scholars argue, look, if you got a to be verb and the short form has an A vowel, Yahweh, that means he who causes something to be. He who I guess that's the best way to say it. He who causes to be. He who creates. It's really a statement of creation, creator. A deity with the ability to make something real that has not yet existed. Okay, he who causes to be, who brings something into being, and this is this has a long history in scholarship and in discussion of the name. W.F. Albright argued for this back in the 1920s, and later Frank Moore Cross from Harvard, who was Albright's student. Cross is very familiar to anybody who read Biblical Archaeology Review in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. He argued for this position. Cross's article is kind of famous, Yahweh and the God of the Patriarchs, Harvard Theological Review, volume 55, 1962, is sort of his full explication of this. David Noel Friedman in Journal of Biblical Literature in the 60s as well argued for this. So these are some top-tier scholars of their time, their era, arguing for a causative understanding of the name. Third option, we'll return to the causative in a moment, but the third option is other scholars sort of opt for a more straightforward translation of the verbal phrase as it stands, this is Carpenter's wording, and as it is vocalized in the MT. So they would actually just not sort of favor, or I'm going to be a little bit blunt here, not really pay attention to the short form, the A vowel. They would go with ye, ve, or ye, yeah, third person of the verbal to be root. And they would translate, I will be who I will be. And the implication for those who take this position is that Yahweh will reveal who he is through the things he is about to do to deliver Israel. And again, I mean, you can make a good argument for that in the context. Now, those are the three views that Carpenter outlines. I'm going to add a fourth view here, and this is from an article that I am putting in the protected folder. It's actually something you could Google and find it online. It's there's a link to it online in various places. It's by Charles Isbell. That's Isbel, and the title is "The Divine Name," and it has Hebrew characters here, but the divine name Ehyeh as a symbol of presence in Israelite tradition. And the publication is the Hebrew Annual Review, Volume 2, 1978, and it's 17 pages, pages 101 through 118. Again, I put this in the folder. What's interesting about this is Isbell's article focuses on the first person form, that God's name, in not just in this passage, because look at what God says here. Moses asks him, what's your name? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. He doesn't say, now you should call me Yahweh. He doesn't use the third person. God says, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel. I am, Ehyeh, has sent me to you. He doesn't say to the people of Israel, Yahweh has sent me to you. If you actually, look at in the passage what God's answer is, he uses the first person instead of the third person. And so Isbell, his article is focused on this. He basically asks kind of a logical question. Well, are there other passages in the Hebrew Bible where the first person form is used as a proper name? And there are a handful. I mean, there's like a couple thousand in the third person. But there actually are a couple of instances where the first person form is used as the name. So I want to throw Isbell in here because this is a bit of a different trajectory that's interesting. And I'm going to read you a few things by way of summary here. Again, you can reference Isbell's work here, but just, again, trying to summarize the content for the sake of the episode here. He writes, and again, part of this is him, part of this is me summarizing. It is necessary to establish from the beginning the fact that both in biblical and post-biblical traditions, Ehyeh, again, the first person form, is used as a proper noun, essentially as an allomorph of the more common form Yahweh. Now, an allomorph is an alternate form. That's all the fancy linguistic word allomorph means. So Isbell's saying it's just a fact that you're going to have instances where the first person form is used like an alternative, proper name, an alternative to the third person form that is much more common. Back to the content here, clearly the starting point for this understanding must be Exodus 3:14, as Bell says, where it has long been recognized that the phrase Ehyeh has sent me is the precise equivalent of Yahweh has sent me in the very next verse. Now, let's go back to Exodus 3. Now, I'm going to read it. I'm going to start in verse 13 again. Now, just look at what the text does. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am, Ehyeh asher Ehyeh, okay? And he said, again, God is still the speaker. And God said, say this to the people of Israel, I am, Ehyeh has sent me to you. Now here's verse 15. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. Both verses have God saying to Moses, say this to them. And they both have a deity has sent me to you. But in verse 14, it's Ehyeh, and in verse 15, it's Yahweh. or Yahya, however you want to, say that. The Y and the W again are interchangeable. So Yahweh, back to back, those two verses, first person, third person, in exactly the same formulation as God's answer to Moses, which is really interesting, and it's very easy to not notice that. So back to Isbell, he says the third example, again, in the course of his article, he has other examples, but he refers to a couple of things. Like one of the things, he refers to Psalm 50, I think it's Psalm 50 or 51. It's Psalm 50, verse 21 he uses. And then his third example is one I'm going to pluck out here. Well, I might as well take them in order. The three examples that Isbell uses are Psalm 50, 21, 2 Samuel 7, 6, and Hosea 1, 9. He says in all three of these instances, the Hebrew syntax, and again, if you know some Hebrew, you'll benefit from Isbell's article. If you don't, you can still get some things out of it, which is why I put it in the folder. And you could Google it too. But in all three of these verses, the grammar, the syntax, not only allows for Ehyeh to be a proper personal deity name, but pretty much requires it. I mean, he makes a good argument. Hosea 1:9, the ESV has it, translates it this way. And the Lord said, call his name not my people. Again, this is the child of Hosea and Gomer. Okay. Call his name not my people, for you are not my people. And ESV has, I am not your God. But what Isbell says is the way you really should translate this is, you are not my people, and I am is not your God. Like it's an actual proper name. 2 Samuel 7, 6. God says, again to David, this is the Davidic covenant passage, I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. Isbell argues that the last part of that verse should be translated, I am has been moving about in a tent, okay, for my dwelling. So that the point would be, as a proper name, was the one traveling in the tent and living in the tabernacle, that kind of thing. So again, his argument is going to be grammatical and syntactical. What's the last one, or the other one that we didn't get to yet? Psalm 50, 21. These things you have done, and I have been silent, and you thought that I was one like yourself. But now I rebuke you and lay the charge before you. So that's ESV. Isbell argues this. He says it should be translated something like this. These things you have done, and I have been silent. You thought that I am was like you, but now I'm going to rebuke you. Okay, so on and so forth. So he points out these three passages, and here's his conclusion. Again, if you're interested in this, and I find it personally interesting, you can get the article, but here's Isbell's conclusion, why I wanted to lump him in the name discussion. He writes, the self-disclosure of Yahweh plainly included the willingness to speak a personal word about himself, to put himself on the spot promisorially, like God's going to promise Moses some things here, and openly. It included his readiness to say, I will be with you, I will become God to you, and to say these things before his capacity to act changingly had been demonstrated in a given situation, but also before the capacity of Israel to be a people in a new situation had been demonstrated. In short, Yahweh's self-disclosure involved no less than his willingness to say to Israel, I am. In other words, this is my name, I am. And the Israelites were supposed to again think or conclude that that can only mean one thing. God is going to be with us. He's promised to be with us, and he will be with us. In other words, Isbell is saying this is what their response would have been to the first person, I am. That's your answer, I am. So he links it to the promise language that you're going to find a little bit, as we keep reading, and then the acts that God does, in history for Israel. Isbell continues, for Israel, this divine willingness to say, I am, implied that faith must not be withheld until after a demonstration of divine power. Let me just stop there. When God says, I am, God expected them to respond with faith. Well, that's the answer. We wanted to know, what was going on, and God says, here's my name, I am. They were supposed to interpret that as a promise to be with them and then respond accordingly before God ever even got down to business. Before he did anything spectacular, he wanted them to respond in faith. Of course, look what Moses does. It's anything but a response to faith, and he's the leader. But again, Isbell is arguing that this is the point. Faith must not be withheld until after a demonstration of divine power. Faith which could so easily be retracted at the hint of a new crisis in which God had not yet acted specifically and openly to the satisfaction of everyone. Thus, if the saying of yeah, I am, meant that God had accepted his covenant responsibility to Israel in advance of and irregardless of particular untoward circumstances, it also constituted a challenge for Israel to respond covenantally as people in advance of whatever might lie in the future. For the faith of Israel to become as forward-looking as was the promise of God to be present would be to approach the real meaning of being people and would make possible the desired relationship of covenant. That's the end of his conclusion. So I think this is a really worthwhile article. It's going to sound new because everybody's sort of fixated on Yahweh. And again, I still, for the life of me, don't understand why people get hung up on this. Oh, the right pronunciation of God's name is Yahshua or Yeshua, or the alphabet soup with the two consonants or whatever. Why do we get fixed on this? I mean, there are people out there who spend more time on this, and they're not linguistically informed, than they do on the Great Commission or something, that Jesus told us to do. Or, I still don't understand it. But what apparently they don't get is that, guess what? That's a proper name for God too. And you'll never see that brought into the discussion because that, rattles the cage. It's a fly in the ointment, for these people that are fixated on this kind of discussion. Again, that for the most part, they don't get right anyway. I'll be honest with you. Sometimes I can't tell what in the world, where in the world they're coming from as far as the pronunciations are offered. Sometimes they're clear. They have some relationship to Hebrew, it's like the first syllable especially. But again, this is not a hill to die on, the exact pronunciation. You've actually got, I'll throw Isbell in here because, and that's just the first person. So you've got three reasonable approaches to the third person form. And you've got one that focuses on the first person form. They're all viable. And I think regardless of which of the three third person forms you pick, the first person form is there. It just is what it is, pardon the pun. So you have to accept that in your talk about God's name as well. You just must, because that's what the text has in a few places. Where I'm at, I'm still at number 2, the Hifil form of the third person. People, again, can go up to my website. Again, put it in Google, drmsh.com, and the 4 consonants, YHWH, you're going to find the page. I still think number 2 is appealing. I have a detailed discussion up there. I favor the second view for the third person translation. I am he who causes to be, all that is. And it just makes sense to me. I have also, and we're going to have a link to this on the episode page. There's also a video of me on YouTube going through, some software. It's a screen capture video of why the pronunciation, is what it is, that sort of thing. And it's not something else. So if you want more detail, you can drill down on those things. So I don't really see anything. There's no conclusive argument against number 2. Now, scholars, pick at it because they'll say things like, well, the haya or the hava verb, we don't see that in the Hifil causative stem in any other of the Northwest Semitic languages. Okay. Do we have to have a corresponding Northwest Semitic form for every blasted word in the vocabulary of the Hebrew Bible? Is that, do we have to have that? No. And it doesn't work in reverse either. I mean, nobody's going to say, well, look at this form in Ugaritic, and no, I reject that because I can't find that form in the Hebrew Bible. That can't be real Semitic. Nobody says that. So I think that sort of criticism is skewered. Again, I'm not going to get into what might be motivating such things, but that's the kind of argument you'll see against taking the third person form as a Hifil causative stem form. I just don't find that persuasive. I don't really see any reason that this can't be. It makes a lot of sense. But again, the other options are viable too. And I do really appreciate Isbell's contribution with the first person form of the name. I want to take some sidebar notes now on the divine name itself. There are just a few interesting things that I think this audience will appreciate, and do a little bit of drill down here just to talk about the name in maybe a slightly different way. In Sarna's commentary, his Exodus commentary, he writes this: Ehya asher ehya. Again, this phrase has variously been translated: I am that I am who I will be that I will be, or what I will be. It clearly evokes Yahweh, YHWH, the specific proper name of Israel's God. Again, that's the third person form. The one known in English as the Tetragrammaton, that is, the four consonants. The phrase also indicates that the earliest recorded understanding of the divine name was as a verb derived from the stem HVH, hava, or YH, haya. HVH is an earlier form of HYH, the to be verb. Either it expresses the quality of absolute being, the eternal, unchanging, dynamic presence, or it means he causes to be. Again, there's the Hifil, perspective. YHWH is the third person masculine singular. Ehya is the corresponding first person singular. This latter is used here because name giving in the ancient world implied the wielding of power over the one named. This is all a little sidebar to the sidebar. This is why, like in demonic texts, an exorcist will want to know the name of the demon, because it was believed that if you have the name of the demon, you could exercise power over it. This sort of thinking. Back to Sarna. This latter is used here because name giving in the ancient world implied the wielding of power over the one name. Hence, the divine name can only proceed from God himself. So what Sarna is saying, the reason God uses the first person here is so that the person asking for the information couldn't use the third person and get it right. Now, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of an interesting note. Maybe that's in view. Again, you're not going to find a whole lot of defense of that idea, but it's interesting for what it's worth. And Sarna then adds an interesting note. Now catch this. In the course of the Second Temple period, let me repeat that. In the course of the Second Temple period roughly in round numbers is 500 BC to 70 AD or 100 AD. We'll make it even rounder, okay? In the course of the Second Temple period, the Tetragrammaton came to be regarded as charged with metaphysical potency and therefore ceased to be pronounced. It was replaced in speech by Adonai, Lord, rendered into Greek kurios. Often the vowels of Adonai would later accompany YHWH in written texts when vowels were added in the early medieval period. This gave rise to the mistaken form Jehovah. The original pronunciation was eventually lost, and modern attempts at recovery are conjectural. At the end of this selection, what do I want you to notice there? That people only got the notion, as far as the textual evidence, okay, and the historical evidence goes, they only got the notion of not pronouncing the name in the Second Temple period. That means earlier, we have no idea if Israelites felt free to say Yahweh or Ehya. They very well could have. So this notion that from the moment of the conversation on Sinai at the burning bush, people would not pronounce the name of God, there's actually no way to prove that, and there's no proof for it. In the Second Temple period, there's a lot of proof for it, because that is the point. That's the point, textually, where we see these kind of changes with the divine name happen in the texts. So it's an assumption that you couldn't pronounce the name as an Israelite really prior to 500 BC. But there's no way to establish that. Anchor Bible Dictionary adds this: the form Jehovah results from reading the consonants of the Tetragrammaton, again YHWH, with the vowels of the surrogate word Adonai. Now you say Adonai begins with an A, Jehovah begins with an E. How does that work? It's a feature of Hebrew consonants. Okay, Adonai is a guttural. It begins with a guttural consonant, and the schwa, the vocal schwa under a guttural, is going to be the A class. The Jehovah begins with a yod. That is not a guttural, and so the vocal schwa under that will be eh. Again, end of linguistic spasm there. But they're the same thing. It's just there are linguistic reasons why one is ah or a and one is e. Okay, back to the selection. The form Jehovah results from reading the consonants of the tetragrammaton with the vowels of the surrogate Adonai. The dissemination of this form is usually traced to Petrus Galatinus, confessor to Pope Leo X, who in 1518 AD transliterated the 4 Hebrew letters with the Latin letters, okay, JHVH, together with the vowels of Adonai, producing the artificial form Jehovah. This confused usage may, however, have begun as early as 1100 AD. I mean, there is a manuscript or two that you can show to make that argument. While the hybrid form Jehovah has met much resistance and is universally regarded as an ungrammatical aberration, it nonetheless passed from Latin into English and other European languages and has been hallowed by usage in hymns and the ASV. It is used only a few times in the KJV and not at all in the RSV. Now that's from Thompson's article on Yahweh in the Anchor Bible Dictionary. Why do I bring this up? First, Jehovah is an artificial form. It is an incorrect form. Whether you want to tell that to Jehovah's Witnesses or not, that's up to you. And frankly, it isn't going to matter to them. Jehovah's Witnesses, A, they don't know Hebrew, and B, if they're not Hebrew linguists, it's not going to faze them. So I wouldn't bother with that. It's more something that you should know. I used to, when I had seminary students, again, who had at least a year of Hebrew, I would mark off if I ever saw Jehovah in a paper. And I would say, you should know better. Okay, just stop it. Why did you take first year? I mean, I wasn't this cruel. Okay, why did you take first year Hebrew? I mean, like get with the program here. Know what's going on. So I bring it up for that reason. And also, again, to show you how recent this is. I mean, you have a really good textual basis for saying this is like around the time of Luther. This starts maybe earlier, but it's not anywhere close to being in the biblical period. At the earliest, this is 1100 AD. That would be over a millennium after Jesus. Okay, we're in 2 millennium when you go back into the Old Testament period. That's a long time. So I don't want to hear this talk about Jehovah, being the actual, name of God. It's not. It's not. It has a traceable history. Another publication, I have put this one in the folder as well, by Kristen DeTroyer. This article is called The Names of God, Their Pronunciation, and Their Translation. Subtitle, A Digital Tour of Some of the Main Witnesses. Again, you can actually find that on the internet, but I put it in the folder anyway. The last name is D-E with a space, and then Troyer, T-R-O-Y-E-R. Kristen DeTroyer, The Names of God. Put that into Google, you'll find it, or you can use the protected folder. You have to be a newsletter subscriber to get to the protected folder. DeTroyer writes this on pages 3 to 5. I'm just plucking out a few paragraphs here and there on pages 3 and 5. What does one read in old codices, such as Codex Leningrad and Codex Aleppo? I'll stop there. These are the 2 oldest complete or mostly complete manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible that we have. Leningradensis is the oldest complete Hebrew Bible. And we know, I'm trying to remember, I always get this, I always have to look it up, and I didn't look it up beforehand. It's either 1007 or 1107 AD, because the scribe, the copyist, put the date on it. Aleppo is not complete. It's missing most of the Torah because of a fire, but that's in the 900s. Okay? What do those manuscripts, how do they point or vocalize the divine name? Good question. Most of the printed Hebrew Bibles, this is back to DeTroyer, most of the printed Hebrew Bibles are based on Codex Leningrad or Leningradensis, a codex dated to, there we go, 1007, 1008. She has, I've seen the other one, just say 1008 since we're dealing with her article here. Located at the Library of St. Petersburg, again in Russia. This codex is the oldest complete Hebrew Bible. Most scholarly editions of the Bible are based on this codex. That's certainly true. There is a Hebrew Bible project in operation now that's using Aleppo as its starting point, but we'll wait for that to get completed. Back to Detroyer. The usual form of the name of God, however, in Codex Leningrad is, now this is interesting. Here's how it's pointed. It's YHWH, again, reading right to left here in Hebrew, or in English, YHWH. It has the E vowel and the final A vowel. In other words, there is no O vowel. Let me say that again. The usual form of the name of God in Codex Leningradensis does not have the O vowel. So again, if you have people, Jehovah, that'd be Leningradensis. No. And may I add, no. It has yeh and then va. Yeh, va. There's no O vowel. There's the scribe just didn't, that wasn't the way you pronounced it. That wasn't the way you pointed it. The O vowel is missing. So Detroyer says, in other words, there's a holum, an O sound missing in the printed form of the Tetragrammaton. The first form, this okay, yeah, va, e, a, and with the missing O. Her approach, and it's not unique to her, but she says this form can be read as the Aramaic noun Shema, because that has the which is the word for the name, the divine name. So her view is that the reason why they took the four consonants in Leningradensis, and Leningradensis again is early 11th century, and that's going to be a copy of a copy of a copy. It has a long history. So back into the early Middle Ages, we'll say, when they wanted to add vowels to the divine name, they added an E sound. It's a vocal shava, and then the comets on the last syllable, taking the vowels not from Adonai. Adonai has an O vowel in there, but taking the vowels from Shema, the name. And if you take those vowels, put them into the four consonants, 2 vowels plus 4 consonants, you get Yeh, Va. Okay? It's just kind of interesting. It's a little bit of Masoretic trivia. I don't know. But it makes sense that they would do that. The name, okay, we'll take the vowels from the name and put them in the name. Makes sense. Yeah, but Jehovah does not have a traceable history back into the major manuscripts, is the point. Detroit, I don't know if it's a woman or a man, Kristen with a K, probably a woman, but let's just say Detroyer, continuing, writes this. Indeed, like many Jewish readers of the Bible today do, God is referred to in the margins of the Masoretic Bible as Ha-Shema, the name, the Jewish Aramaic word for the name. The oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible does hence not render the Tetragrammaton with the Lord Adonai, but with the name. Similarly, Codex Aleppo and the editions of the Rabbinic Bible have the same thing, have the name instead of Adonai. That's where they take the vowels too. Now she or he says, I acknowledge that there are a couple of exceptions to this rule, namely a couple of places where Codex Leningradensis has Adonai as a kere. Okay, kere is a note in the margin from another scribe that says this is what you should read. But what's actually in the text doesn't have the O vowel, but some scribe came along and in a few places put in the margin, read this. Read it with the O vowel. Again, so you had somebody at some point want to do it differently in a handful of places, not at nowhere near every place, but a handful of places. So Detroyer is acknowledging that. Then he or she moves on to another point and asks, was the name pronounced or not? There is no explanation as to why the Tetragrammaton was no longer pronounced. Moreover, all hypotheses regarding the origins of the Kethiv-Kere phenomenon. Kethiv is what is read, what you find in the text, and then Kere is this marginal note, here's what to read. All hypotheses regarding the origins of that system, the Kethiv-Kere phenomenon, are speculative. In the Jewish tradition, there are plenty of statements regarding the non-pronunciation of the name of God. In the Mishnah, Tractate Sanhedrin 10:1, for instance, it is clearly stated that the name of God cannot be pronounced. Now, let me stop there. That's the Mishnah. All right, this is medieval. This is rabbinic stuff. This isn't biblical stuff. Again, I recently posted something about why we shouldn't be appealing to rabbis for biblical exegesis. Again, I don't know how much clearer I can make it. The rabbinic period in history is not synonymous with the biblical period. It's later. In some cases, century, maybe in some cases even a millennium. Okay, this is Mishnah. So by the time of the Mishnah, again, your early Middle Ages. Okay, there is commentary about not pronouncing the name. Only the high priest, back to Detroyer, only the high priest, more specifically on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, can utter the name of God. All other Jews are not supposed to pronounce the name of God. This is the opinion that's in the Mishnah. Continuing, from a difference between the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible and its Greek Septuagint translation, Martin Rizal deduces that only by the time of the Greek translation of the book of Leviticus, the Tetragrammaton was no longer pronounced. And again, the Septuagint is Second Temple period. That's when the Septuagint was translated. Back to Detroyer. According to most scholars, this was somewhere at the end of the 3rd century BCE. The Septuagint of Leviticus reads, quote, "And he that names the name of God, let him die the death," unquote, whereas the Hebrew text can be read as, quote, "he who uses the name of God in vain," unquote. So the Septuagint gets interpretive there. It takes the Hebrew, "he who uses the name of God in vain," or takes the name of, lifts up the name of the Lord in vain. The Septuagint interprets that to say that you shouldn't name the name of God. And again, she's quoting a scholar that says this is the earliest kind of reference I can find to this sort of mentality. So again, back to Sarna, this is what Sarna had said. In the Second Temple period is when you start to see this transition toward not saying the divine name. But before that, you don't. You don't have that. There is also the Isaiah Qumran scroll. This is the great Isaiah scroll, 1Q Isaiah A, that reads Adonai in 3:7, where the Masoretic text has the Tetragrammaton. So in that text, there's a substitution. The scribe of the Isaiah scroll there did not write the Tetragrammaton, but actually put in the word Adonai. Detroyer says this means that by the late 2nd century BCE, the presumed date of the Isaiah scroll, the Tetragrammaton might have been read as Adonai. So it's suggestive of that. One last comment from Detroyer. The names of God section in her or his essay. There are two important collections of data that one has to take into account when dealing with the name of God: the Elephantine papyri and the Samaritan papyri from Wadi Daliah. They show that the following names of God were in use. Okay, so now you're going back to the 5th century BC. This is earlier. Well, it's earlier in the Second Temple period, but almost back, to the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. Let's just think of it that way. They show that the following names of God were in use. You have YHWH, YHW, YHH, Yahoo, vocalized, or Yahoo, and YH, which would be Yah. The Elephantine papyri date to the 5th century BC. The Wadi Daliah papyri stem from the 4th century BCE. The Elephantine papyri contain the correspondence from the Jewish officials of the Elephantine community to the officials in Samaria and Jerusalem regarding the rebuilding of their recently destroyed temple. So you push it back a little bit. There are multiple forms of the divine name in those texts. Again, and this is a period before the texts were, before the vowels were added. The vowels were only added, again, in the Middle Ages. But in the Second Temple period, before the vowels were added, you have things like scribes taking the divine name out and putting in Adonai, or you have the instance that we just read where they'll do some other kind of thing in the text to make it seem, again, like they're trying not to write it or pronounce it. You only see that, the evidence for that is right around the 3rd century BCE or BC, right in the middle, so to speak, of the Second Temple period. You go a century earlier, And you have texts that not only have the 4 consonants in there, but they actually have variations. And some of the variations can only be vocalized one way, like YH, yeah. Even though they don't have vowels in them, but that's the textual situation as it is. So at least back then, there doesn't seem to be any predilection towards swapping the divine name out. But a century later, you start to see that. And, you go a little bit beyond that, and that's when, back to Sarna. Sarna says it's really in this period that you start to see this notion develop that you shouldn't pronounce the divine name. But before that, you actually can't argue that. There's actually no evidence for it. So, should we really be taking a Second Temple sort of custom, scribal custom, and presuming that when scribes sat down in the exile or earlier to write a biblical text or to edit a biblical text, that they were doing this kind of thing? Well, we really can't. We don't have any evidence for it. So, just take that for what it's worth. It's just kind of interesting. Well, let's go to verse 18. We're going to finish the chapter here. Just a few more observations. We'll be out of chapter 3 finally. Verse 18, we read this. We've had this conversation with God. This is my name, so on and so forth. You go to the to the leadership in Israel. In verse 18, we read, "They will listen to your voice." God says to Moses, "Look, they'll listen. They will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God.'" I just want to draw attention briefly to the elders here. It's kind of an overlooked group. There are a lot of good articles on this. Elder in the Old Testament, in Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible. Davies, G.H. Davies wrote that particular entry. He writes this: "Elders are thus represented as a constant feature of Israel's life from the days of Moses to those of Ezra. And they were as prominent under the monarchy as before it. Elders are mentioned over 41 times in the Pentateuch. Again, that's a lot more than you would think. Carpenter, in his commentary, adds, elders are mentioned at least 12 times in Exodus, from 3:16 to Exodus 24:14. Moses always works with or through them, never against them. But do you notice a bit of a problem here, or at least some would say this is a problem? You have back again in verse 16, go and gather the elders of Israel together. And then verse 18, God says, look, they're going to listen to you. You and the elders go to the king, blah, 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 blah. Some would say, well, that's anachronistic because we only get elders in Exodus 18, with Jethro. Hey, you need some help here, Moses. You need to appoint people. But it's actually not. This verse doesn't preempt or it's not misplaced before Exodus 18. Because in Exodus 18, you don't have the word elders. Moses, at Jethro's advice, appoints judges. It's a different word. Specifically, Exodus 18, 21, 22 is where you get this. So we don't have anachronistic things. There's going to be anachronistic things in Exodus, and we'll hit them when we come there. But my point is that if you come along, this sort of thing, it's not anachronistic. There's not a 1-to-1 equation between judges and elders. Okay, even though a lot of the discussion sort of assumes that. Sarna adds that the elders of verse 16 are the elders, Hebrew zekanim, who are frequently mentioned in the Exodus narratives, though little information about them is offered. I mean, as you just heard, it's more than a dozen times, even in the book itself, and over 40 times, just generally. So, what do we have here? When Moses goes to the Israelite leadership in Egypt, again, at the end of chapter 4, Exodus 4:31 is when he actually gets around to doing this. And when he meets with Pharaoh, which is Exodus 5, guess what? The elders, the leadership that's already in Egypt. Again, this has nothing to do with the appointees under Jethro after they get out, after they leave Egypt. The elders who are already there, they do what God said they would do. They believe Moses. They believe him. So God had anticipated that. And again, he had anticipated Pharaoh's resistance as well. Exodus 3:18. Again, they will listen to your voice. You and the elders of Israel go to the king of Egypt and say, the Lord God of the Hebrews has met with us. Let us go out and sacrifice the Lord our God. Verse 19, but I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it after he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor, and any woman who lives in her house, for silver and gold jewelry, and for clothing. And you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. And that's the end of Exodus 3. Exodus 3, of course, anticipates chapter 4, and, chapters 4 through 6, really. And really most of what follows, with respect to the confrontation with Pharaoh and the plagues and all that. God is going to do something new. He has come down, again, think of that going down, coming down language. He has come down to act and fulfill his covenant and guarantees the outcome by virtue of his presence. And again, back to what Isbell said, if the whole point of using the first person is to essentially say, I am. In other words, God has decided to act now and to be with them. And he expects their response to be the same before God ever even rolls up his sleeves and gets down to business. To me, that's not only interesting, but it's kind of a compelling point. It's a good preaching point, actually, of what the name itself might convey in that particular form. So, we're set up now to get into Exodus 4 and the confrontation with Pharaoh, I think, pretty well, as far as what God expects, what God has promised, both directly and implicitly, for the rest of the story.
All right, Mike, you sure? Do we need a part 4? We got it. We got 3 wrapped up.
I am positive.
All right, that sounds good.